the billionaire who chose love over power in a city that measured worth by the height of its towers. Evelyn Vale lived above almost everyone and belonged to almost no one. At 32, she was the chairwoman of Vale International, the woman whose signature could move factories, banks, newspapers, and governments with the quiet force of weather. That evening, she had just completed the most ruthless acquisition of her career, a deal that would make her empire nearly untouchable. Yet the victory settled on her shoulders, like a coat made of stone. From the outside, this was the night Evelyn Vale became more powerful than any woman in the city had ever been. From the inside, it was the night she realized power had no warmth. The boardroom on the 79th floor was still lit long after sunset. Rain pressed against the glass walls in silver lines, blurring the skyline into a field of cold stars. Around the polished table, men twice Evelyn's age lowered their voices when she spoke and smiled too quickly when she was silent. The acquisition documents lay before her in neat stacks, heavy with clauses, numbers, and consequences. A manufacturing giant that had once rejected her mother's partnership was now folded into Vale International, its assets absorbed, its board dismantled, its proud name reduced to a subsidiary on a page. Evelyn signed the final page without hesitation. Her pen moved cleanly, almost gently. That was the part people always misunderstood. Ruthlessness in her world did not need to look violent. It wore pearl earrings, used black ink, and waited patiently for the other side to make one mistake. Applause rose around the room. Congratulations, Chairwoman Vale. Your mothers would have been proud. At that last sentence, Evelyn's fingers paused on the pen cap. No one noticed except Nora Lynn, her assistant, who stood near the door with a tablet clasped against her chest. Nora's expression remained professionally calm, but her eyes softened for half a second. It was the kind of small mercy Evelyn had learned to value, because it never asked to be acknowledged. Evelyn looked up, her face serene. "Thank you, gentlemen. Let's make sure history produces returns." Soft laughter followed. Relief, admiration, fear. It all sounded the same when it came from people who needed her favor. Victor Vale approached after the others began gathering their papers. Her uncle had the same cool grey eyes as her late father, though none of the restraint. He wore charm the way some men wore expensive watches, polished and visible. Since Evelyn's mother died and her father withdrew from public life, Victor had become the family's loudest voice, the man who claimed to protect the Vale legacy while tightening his hand around it. "You were flawless tonight," he said. Evelyn closed the folder. Flawless usually means no one saw the work. That's why you are where you are. He placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. To anyone else, it would look affectionate. Evelyn only felt the weight of ownership. "There's a gala waiting downstairs," Victor continued. "Smile for the press. Let the city worship you. We'll discuss the next phase afterward." "The next phase?" His smile deepened. "Don't sound so tired. Winning is only useful if we consolidate." Evelyn understood enough not to ask more in that room. An hour later, she stood beneath a chandelier large enough to illuminate a cathedral, wearing a silver gown that seemed designed to make her look less like a woman and more like a monument. The celebration gala filled the grand ballroom of the Vale Hotel, where champagne flowed in crystal rivers, and every guest pretended not to calculate the value of everyone else's presence. Cameras flashed when she entered. Reporters called her name. Politicians leaned close to donors. Socialites turned their bodies toward her as if she were the evening's sun. Evelyn gave them what they came for, a calm smile, a few graceful words, a toast to partnership, resilience, and the future. She let them admire the version of her they understood. Disciplined, untouchable, victorious. She had been trained for this since childhood. Never let them see uncertainty. Never reach for someone first. Never confuse applause with affection. Yet the louder the room became, the more distant she felt from her own life. A senator congratulated her and asked about infrastructure interests in the South. A museum patron praised her generosity and mentioned a funding gap in the same breath. A rival CEO kissed the air beside her cheek and whispered that only Evelyn Vale could make destruction look elegant. She accepted every compliment like a coin dropped into a locked box. Near midnight, after her second untouched glass of champagne, Evelyn stepped away from the ballroom under the excuse of taking a private call. The corridor outside was lined with white roses and security staff pretending not to watch her. She moved past them with the effortless authority of someone no one dared stop. At the end of the hall, a side door stood slightly ajar. Voices drifted through. Victor's voice came first. She needs to be settled before the annual summit. The acquisition gives us leverage, but the Blackwell alliance gives us permanence. Another board member replied, Adrian Blackwell is acceptable to the family office. Politically useful too. She won't like being cornered, someone said. Victor gave a low laugh. Evelyn likes results. She'll resist the language, not the logic. Marriage is a structure, gentlemen. Affection is decorative. There was a pause, then the faint clink of glass. And if she refuses, she won't. Her mother understood duty. Evelyn inherited that much at least. For a moment, Evelyn stood absolutely still. The music from the ballroom reached her in muffled waves, elegant and meaningless. Beyond the door, her future was being arranged by men who toasted her brilliance while treating her life as a negotiable asset. She had expected strategy. She had expected pressure. What she had not expected was the quiet humiliation of realizing that even at the peak of power, she was still someone's daughter, someone's niece, someone's signature to be directed toward the proper line. Her mother's name struck deeper than the rest. Margaret Vale had been dead for 8 years, long enough for people to turn her into whatever arguments suited them: duty, grace, legacy, silence. Evelyn had spent nearly a decade trying to become worthy of the empire Margaret left behind, only to find that the empire always wanted more. She stepped back before anyone could see her. Nora was waiting halfway down the corridor, as if she had guessed Evelyn would need an exit before Evelyn knew it herself. Car is ready at the east entrance, Nora said softly. Evelyn looked at her. Did you know? Nora did not insult, pretending not to understand. I knew they were planning to raise the Blackwell matter. I didn't know they would speak of it tonight. The Blackwell matter, Evelyn repeated, almost smiling. In their world, even a woman's heart could be softened into a matter. Nora's grip tightened on the tablet. Do you want me to cancel the rest of your appearances? No. Evelyn glanced toward the ballroom doors, where applause suddenly rose again for someone else's speech. Tell them I had an urgent call with Singapore. Will you go home? Evelyn should have said yes. Her penthouse waited above the city, with warm lights, silent rooms, and a security team trained to disappear. Instead, she looked past Nora, toward the rain-dark window at the end of the hall. I'll drive myself. Nora hesitated. Evelyn, I need an hour where no one knows where I am. It was not a request, but Nora heard the exhaustion beneath it. She nodded once, and disappeared to make the arrangements. 10 minutes later, Evelyn left through the east entrance beneath a plain black umbrella, her diamond cufflinks hidden beneath the sleeves of a tailored coat thrown over her gown. She dismissed the driver, took the keys, and slid behind the wheel of a dark sedan usually reserved for staff. The security team would hate it. Victor would be furious. The board would call it irresponsible. The thought almost made her breathe easier. Rain washed the city into fragments. Neon signs stretched across the wet streets. Traffic thinned as she drove away from the financial district, past glass towers, luxury boutiques, and private clubs where people like her bought privacy by the hour. She did not choose a destination. She simply followed the road downhill, toward older neighborhoods where the buildings were shorter and the streetlights warmer. The car began to shudder near the Riverside district. At first, Evelyn ignored it. Machines, like people, often made small complaints before surrendering. Then the dashboard flashed, the engine coughed, and the sedan rolled to a stop beside a row of shuttered shops. For several seconds, Evelyn sat in the rain-blurred darkness, hands on the steering wheel, and felt an absurd laugh rise in her throat. She had just acquired a multinational company before dinner, and now she could not persuade a car to move 3 more blocks. Her phone had 1% battery. She tried Nora. The screen went black before the call connected. The laugh vanished. Outside, the rain was colder than it had looked from behind glass. Evelyn stepped onto the pavement, the hem of her gown immediately drinking water. The old Riverside district smelled of wet brick, river mud, fried garlic from a late-night food stall, and the faint medicinal scent of a pharmacy sign glowing green at the corner. Reyes Community Pharmacy. Its lights were still on. She crossed the street with her coat, pulled tight, heels striking uneven pavement. By the time she reached the awning, her hair had loosened from its careful arrangement, and rain traced down the side of her face like tears she had not permitted herself to shed. A bell chimed when she pushed open the door. Warmth met her first, then the scent of chamomile, paper bags, antiseptic, and something faintly sweet, like honey dissolved in tea. The pharmacy was small, older than she expected, with wooden shelves, handwritten labels, and a counter polished by years of elbows and patient waiting. A corkboard near the entrance held notices for flu shots, a lost cat, free blood pressure checks, and a children's charity drive. A man looked up from behind the counter. He was perhaps in his early 30s, wearing a navy sweater with the sleeves pushed to his forearms. His hair was dark and slightly untidy, his face open in a way that made Evelyn instinctively wary. He did not stare at her diamonds. He did not recognize her. He simply saw a drenched woman standing in his pharmacy past closing time. "You're soaked," he said. It was such an ordinary observation that Evelyn had no prepared answer. "My car stopped outside," she said after a moment. "My phone died. May I use yours?" "Of course." He came around the counter and handed her a towel from a clean stack near the consultation room. When she took it, he noticed her trembling hands, but said nothing that would embarrass her. "The landline's behind the counter," he said. "But sit first. You look like you've had a long day." That too should have been ordinary instead. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened. A long day, not a historic triumph, not a strategic milestone, not a consolidation of power. Just a long day. She lowered herself into the chair he pulled near a small heater. The pharmacy's warmth seeped slowly through the wet fabric of her coat. He disappeared briefly into the back room and returned with a plain grey coat, worn at the cuffs but clean. "Here," he said. "Put this on until yours dries a little. I'm fine." "You're freezing." I said I'm fine. He did not retreat, but he did not push either. He only held the coat out and waited with a patience that made resistance feel childish. At last Evelyn took it. The coat was too large and smelled faintly of soap and cedar. It swallowed the sharp lines of her evening gown, softened her silhouette, made her look less like someone designed by public relations, and more like a woman who had walked through rain because she had nowhere else to go. He turned away to give her privacy. "My name is Daniel," he said, filling an electric kettle. "Daniel Reyes." "Eve," she replied, before she could stop herself. "Not Evelyn Vale, not chairwoman, not Ms. Vale, just Eve." Daniel set a mug of tea on the small table beside her. "Well, Eve, the tour company may take a while in this weather. You can wait here." She wrapped her hands around the mug. The heat surprised her. So did the ache behind her eyes. "Do you always stay open this late?" she asked. "Only when Mrs. Alvarez forgets her blood pressure pills or Mr. Chen pretends his cough isn't serious." Tonight it was both. There was no pride in his voice, no performance of kindness. He spoke as if caring for people was not an act of virtue, but simply the day's work. Evelyn looked around the small pharmacy again. Everything here had a name attached to it. Mrs. Alvarez. Mr. Chen Lost Cat. Charity Drive. People did not pass through this place as accounts or liabilities. They were remembered. Daniel noticed her studying the board. You from around here? No, office worker. The question was so far from the truth that she almost smiled. Something like that. Your boss must be terrible if you're wandering around in a storm dressed like you came from a wedding and a board meeting. At the same time, my boss is demanding. Then I hope she pays you well. This time, Evelyn did smile. It was small, brief, and unfamiliar on her own face. Daniel smiled back, not as if he had won something, but as if her smile had simply been a good thing to see. The landline rang before she could answer. Daniel picked it up, spoke gently to an elderly customer, and promised to deliver a prescription in the morning if the rain did not stop. Evelyn listened without meaning. To his voice changed for the person on the line, slower, warmer, threaded with respect. No impatience, no calculation. When he hung up, he found her watching him. What? He asked. Nothing, you're patient. I sell medicine. Half the job is explaining what people are afraid to ask. And the other half, not making them feel small for needing help. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the tea. The sentence landed quietly, but it reached places applause never had. For years, people had needed her, feared her, admired her, resented her. They had wanted approvals, signatures, introductions, money, protection, concessions. Even love, when offered to her, had arrived wrapped in advantage. But this man in a small pharmacy with rain tapping at the windows had given her a towel, a coat, and tea without asking who she was, without asking what she could do for him. Outside, thunder rolled over the river. The lights flickered once. Evelyn felt absurdly, as if the entire city had stepped back and left her alone with a life she might have had if she had been born someone else. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely. You don't have to answer, but are you okay? There it was, not polished, not strategic, not followed by a request. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the mug. She had been asked for decisions that affected thousands of employees. She had been asked for statements after market crashes, donations after disasters, forgiveness after betrayals. She had been asked to be strong, graceful, loyal, brilliant, available, and unbreakable. She could not remember the last time someone had asked whether she was okay, and seemed prepared to accept an honest answer. For a moment, she almost gave one. I don't know, she said. Daniel's expression did not change with pity. He only nodded, as if uncertainty was not a weakness, but a place where a person could rest. That counts as an answer. The tow truck arrived nearly an hour later. By then, Evelyn's phone had charged enough from an old cable Daniel found in a drawer to receive 17 missed calls from Nora and 3 from Victor. She ignored Victor's name and called Nora only long enough to say she was safe. When she stood to leave, Daniel's coat slipped from her shoulders. Keep it until you get home, he said. I can't take your coat. You can return it when your car decides to betray you again. She looked at him, and for reasons she could not explain, the thought of returning did not feel impossible. Thank you, Daniel. Good night, Eve. The name followed her into the rain, not Chairwoman Vale, not the woman who had conquered a company that morning. Just Eve, carrying warmth beneath a borrowed coat, stepping back into a city that still believed it owned her. By the time Nora's replacement car arrived and took Evelyn away, the pharmacy lights had dimmed behind her. Daniel locked the front door, stacked the empty tea mugs in the sink, and returned to the chair by the heater to fold the towel she had used. That was when something glittered beneath the edge of the small table. He bent down and picked it up. A diamond cufflink rested in his palm, cold and impossibly delicate, the kind of object that did not belong in his pharmacy any more than a crown belonged on a kitchen shelf. Under the light, the stone flashed with a restrained brilliance, and along the platinum edge were 2 engraved initials, E. V. Daniel stared at them, the warmth of the evening slowly giving way to a question he could not yet name. Daniel did not sleep well that night. It was not because of the rain, though it kept tapping at the narrow window above his kitchen sink until nearly dawn. It was not because of the heater either, with its old metallic size and uneven warmth. He had grown up in rooms where pipes complained and walls remembered too much. Ordinary noises rarely disturbed him. It was the cufflink. He had placed it in a small paper envelope and set it on the counter beside the cash register, where he kept lost things: umbrellas, reading glasses, a child's mitten, once even a wedding ring that had sent Mrs. Coleman running back in tears. Yet all night he kept seeing those initials under the pharmacy light. EV. By morning, Daniel had told himself a dozen reasonable stories. Maybe she worked for someone important. Maybe the cufflink belonged to a brother, a date, a husband she had not mentioned. Maybe the initials meant nothing. People were allowed to have secrets. He, of all people, knew that names could carry weight long after the world stopped asking permission. Still, when the bell above the pharmacy door rang just after 10, he looked up too quickly. She stood there in a grey sweater, jeans, and white sneakers, her hair tied low at her neck. No black car waited outside. No assistant hovered behind her. Without the tailored suit and diamond stillness, she looked younger, almost uncertain, as if she had stepped out of one life and was still learning how to stand inside another. Daniel's hand moved to the envelope before she spoke. "You found it," she said. "I did." He placed the envelope on the counter between them. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, as though that small packet contained more than a piece of jewelry. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize until this morning. It happens to people who wear diamond cufflinks." A faint smile appeared before he could stop it. "Less often, probably." Her eyes lifted to his, and there it was again, that brief softening, like a window opening in a tall building. She had expected suspicion, questions, perhaps admiration or calculation. Daniel gave her none of those things. He simply stood there in his green pharmacy apron, sleeves rolled at the forearms, treating her lost cufflink the way he would have treated Mrs. Coleman's wedding ring, carefully, without entitlement. Evelyn slipped the envelope into her bag. "Thank you, Daniel." He noticed she did not offer a last name. He also noticed that he did not ask. Instead, he nodded toward the shelves. "You came all the way here just for that?" "I suppose I did. It must be important." She paused. "It belongs to a life that doesn't let go easily." There were words inside that sentence that Daniel could feel but not see he had learned. From years of handing medication to people who could not afford to fall apart, that pain often entered a room disguised as inconvenience. Before he could reply, the phone rang. Daniel answered, listened, then pulled a notepad closer. "Yes, Mrs. Alvarez, I have it ready." "No, don't come out in this weather. I'll bring it by this afternoon." He glanced toward the window. The sky was heavy, the sidewalk damp. "Have you eaten?" "That doesn't count as breakfast." "Toast is not breakfast if you only think about making it." Evelyn watched him with a curiosity so quiet, it almost felt private. After he hung up, she asked, "You deliver medicine yourself?" "When I can." "Is that profitable?" Daniel gave a small laugh, not mocking, just surprised by the shape of the question. "Not everything has to be." The answer landed harder than he intended. Evelyn looked away, toward the row of cold remedies and vitamins arranged beneath fluorescent lights. In her world, entire divisions were closed if they could not justify their margins. People made presentations about efficiency while somewhere, far away, someone lost a job, a prescription, a home. She had signed papers like that, not carelessly, never carelessly, but signing with sorrow did not always change the consequence. "I didn't mean it that way," she said. "I knows," and strangely she believed him. By noon, the pharmacy was busy. An old man argued affectionately about blood pressure pills. A young mother counted coins before Daniel quietly applied a discount that did not exist in any official system. A teenager came in for cough syrup and left with a lecture about drinking water and sleeping before 2 in the morning. Evelyn stood to the side at first, her presence almost too composed for the cramped space, but slowly she began to help in small ways. She carried a box from the back room when Daniel asked. She sorted paper bags by address. She placed labels in order after he explained the route. The first time she taped a delivery note crookedly, Daniel took one look and said, "That's tragic. It's tape," she replied, offended with unexpected sincerity. "It's commitment. The tape has to believe in itself." For a second she simply stared at him. Then she laughed. It was not the polished laugh of dinner galas or charity podiums, not the soft social sound she had spent half her life perfecting. It escaped before she could manage it, light and startled, and Daniel found himself looking down at the prescription bags with more concentration than necessary. Around 2, he shrugged into his coat and lifted a canvas bag filled with deliveries. Evelyn, who had no sensible reason to remain, picked up the second bag. "You don't have to," he said. "I know, that bag is heavier than it looks. I've carried heavier things." He did not ask what, she did not explain. They walked through Daniel's neighborhood beneath a sky the color of wet stone. It was not poor in the way outsiders liked to imagine poverty. One flat shade of despair, it had cracked sidewalks and stubborn flower pots. Laundromats with handwritten signs, corner stores where clerks knew which children were allowed candy on credit. It had old brick buildings with fire escapes, church bells at the hour, bicycles chained to railings, and murals fading beautifully under years of sun and exhaust. People greeted Daniel by name. At first they looked at Evelyn with curiosity. She was dressed simply, but simplicity could not fully hide quality. Her sweater sat too perfectly on her shoulders. Her shoes were too clean for these streets. Her posture had been shaped by rooms where people stood when she entered. Yet Daniel introduced her only as Eve, and because he did not make a spectacle of her, neither did most of them. Mrs. Alvarez lived on the 3rd floor of a building, with an elevator that had given up on ambition. Daniel took the stairs without complaint. Evelyn followed, the canvas strap cutting into her palm, breath warming her throat by the second landing. When the door opened, a tiny woman with silver hair peered out through thick glasses. "You're late," Mrs. Alvarez declared. "By 6 minutes," Daniel said. "A scandal, and you brought a girl." "A helper." Evelyn lowered her head politely. "Good afternoon," Mrs. studied her. "Too pretty to be a pharmacist." Daniel coughed. Evelyn, to his surprise, smiled. "I'm not one." "Good. He needs someone normal around him." Inside, the apartment smelled of soup, old wood, and lavender soap. Daniel checked the dosage schedule taped to the refrigerator. He noticed the nearly empty bread bag and the bowl untouched on the table. Without making Mrs. Alvarez feel watched, he warmed the soup, set out crackers, and adjusted the window latch that had been letting in cold air. Evelyn stood near the doorway holding the medicine bag, and something inside her shifted. She had approved hospital donations worth millions. She had stood beside governors while cameras flashed and plaques were unveiled. She had funded research wings, emergency programs, scholarships named in her mother's honor. People had applauded. Her name had been engraved in marble. But no one had ever looked at her the way Mrs. Alvarez looked at Daniel, when he placed a spoon in her hand and said gently, "Eat before the noon pill next time. Promise me." The old woman grumbled. Then she promised. It was such a small victory. No headlines, no market movement, no board approval, yet Evelyn felt its weight. They visited Mr. Han, who pretended his knees did not hurt and offered them oranges. They stopped by a retired bus driver, who kept forgetting which pills were morning and which were night. So Daniel drew a sun and moon on the lids with a marker. At the last apartment, a little boy opened the door while his grandmother slept on the sofa. and Daniel lowered his voice, as if entering a church. On the way back, Evelyn carried the empty bag against her chest. "You know all of them," she said. "Most, and they trust you. Trust is convenient in my line of work." "No," she said softly. "It isn't convenient, it's rare." Daniel looked at her then. The wind had loosened a few strands of hair around her face. She seemed both out of place and strangely present, as though the neighborhood had not accepted her but had allowed her, for one afternoon, to stop proving herself. "Your life must be very different," he said. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the strap. "Yes, do you like it?" The question was simple. That was what made it dangerous. She could have given him a graceful answer. She had hundreds. "I'm grateful. I'm fortunate. Responsibility requires sacrifice. Legacy is not about liking or disliking." Instead, after a long moment, she said, "I don't know anymore." Daniel did not pity her. She was grateful for that most of all. Across the city, Vale International rose from the financial district like a blade of glass. On the 48th floor, men and women in dark suits moved with controlled urgency past walls of muted art and floor-to-ceiling views. Evelyn's absence had begun as a manageable inconvenience. By lunch it had become a whisper. By 2, it had acquired shape. In Evelyn's office, Noralyn stood beside the desk with a tablet in one hand and a phone in the other, answering questions with the calm precision of someone extinguishing fires using a silk handkerchief. "Ms. Vale is reviewing the North Harbor file remotely," she said for the 3rd time that afternoon. "If the board requires a response, send it through me." When she ended the call, Victor Vale was standing in the doorway. He did not knock. He never had. Victor believed doors opened because men like him had already decided to enter. At 58, he was elegant in a way that made warmth seem inefficient. His silver hair was combed back flawlessly, his suit immaculate, his expression carved from old family authority. To the public, he was Evelyn's loyal uncle, the man who had helped guide her after her mother's death. Inside the company, people knew better than to confuse loyalty with surrender. Victor did not guide, he positioned. "Where is my niece?" he asked. Nora met his gaze. "In a private meeting." "With whom?" She didn't provide that information. Victor smiled faintly. "You're paid to know what she forgets to say." "I'm paid to support the chairwoman." The smile did not move. "Careful, Nora. Titles change." Before Nora could answer, another man entered behind him. Adrian Blackwell looked like the sort of person magazines called inevitable. Tall, polished, handsome in the precise manner of inherited confidence. His family's influence ran through construction, media, and politics. Every election cycle owed someone a favor with the Blackwell name attached. "Evelyn still unavailable?" Adrian asked, removing his gloves. Nora inclined her head. "I'll let her know you came by." Victor walked to the window as if the office already belonged to him. "This cannot continue. The infrastructure merger requires stability. The Senate committee dinner is next week. Adrian's family is ready to move, but they expect a signal." "A business signal," Nora said carefully. Victor turned. "A personal one would be stronger." Adrian's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes cooled. "Evelyn understands the value of alignment. Our families have circled this possibility for years. Miss Vale makes her own decisions," Nora said. Victor gave a low chuckle. "My niece has been allowed the illusion of independence because until now her instincts served the company. Lately, she seems distracted." Nora said nothing. Silence, she had learned, was sometimes the safest locked door. Victor's gaze sharpened. "When she returns, tell her the board will expect her at dinner tonight. Adrian will escort her. And if she declines..." The temperature in the room seemed to fall. "Then the board will begin asking why the chairwoman of Vale International has time to disappear, but not to secure the future of her own empire." When Victor and Adrian left, Nora finally allowed herself to breathe. She picked up her phone and typed a message with swift, controlled fingers. "Board restless. Victor pushing Adrian Alliance. Your absence noticed, please be careful. Evelyn read it standing outside the pharmacy, where Daniel was unlocking the door after their last delivery. The words on the screen looked as if they belonged to another atmosphere, colder and thinner than the air around her. For a moment, the two worlds overlapped. Mrs. Alvarez's warm soup, Victor's boardroom pressure, Daniel's canvas bag, Adrian's polished gloves, the old woman promising to eat, the Empire demanding obedience. Daniel noticed the change in her face. Bad news, familiar news. He did not ask to see the message. He only opened the pharmacy door and stepped aside so she could enter first. The small gesture almost undid her. Inside, the shop smelled again of paper, antiseptic, and tea. Daniel set the empty bags on the counter. Evelyn looked around at the shelves, the worn floor, the handwritten notice reminding customers to ask if they needed help paying for flu medication. Yesterday, this place had been a shelter from rain. Today, it felt like evidence that another kind of power existed, one that did not announce itself. Daniel nodded. Thank you for helping. I don't think I helped much, you did. It was only a few bags. To you, those two words followed her into stillness. To you. Evelyn had spent years measuring importance by scale, revenue, impact, market share, global reach. She knew how to move numbers large, enough to frighten governments. Yet here, a crooked piece of tape mattered. A warm bowl of soup mattered. A pill taken on time mattered. Being 6 minutes late mattered because someone had been waiting. Daniel walked her to the door. Outside, a black car had arrived at the far end of the block, discreet but unmistakable. Evelyn saw his eyes take it in. He understood more than he said. Perhaps he had understood from the beginning that she did not belong entirely to the name she had given him. Eve, he said. She turned back. He hesitated, then spoke with care. Whatever life is pulling you back to, don't let it convince you this afternoon was small. Evelyn could not answer immediately. If she tried, her voice might reveal too much. So she only said, "Goodbye, Daniel." This time it felt less like an ending than a promise she was not yet brave enough to make. The car door closed behind her. As the vehicle pulled away, Daniel remained outside the pharmacy, one hand in his coat pocket, watching until the taillights turned the corner and disappeared into the wet silver afternoon. From the opposite side of the street, behind the reflection of a bus shelter advertisement, a camera lowered. The photographer checked the image once, then smiled. By evening, before any gossip editor received the file, before any headline could turn curiosity into scandal, a glossy print lay on Victor Vale's desk. In it, Evelyn was stepping out of Daniel's neighborhood wearing ordinary clothes, her face unguarded in a way no corporate portrait had ever captured. Victor picked up the photograph by one corner. For a long moment, he simply stared, then he said very softly, "So this is where you've been hiding." Victor did not raise his voice when he ordered the investigation. That was the frightening part. He stood behind his desk with one hand resting lightly on the polished wood. The city lights of his corner office, turning the glass walls into a mirror. In that reflection, he looked less like a man in control than a man trying very hard not to show how much he had already decided. "Her name is Evelyn Vale," he said to the private security chief he trusted most. "But I want to know everything about the man she's seeing, every address, every employer, every debt, every friend. I want the shape of his life before the first meeting and the shape of his grief after it." The chief nodded once and left. Victor waited until the door closed, then picked up the glossy photograph again. Evelyn in a plain coat in a neighborhood too modest to belong to her world. Her expression was softer there, not weaker, softer, as if some part of her had stepped down from a ledge she had been standing on for years. He hated that softness. He hated that he recognized it. By midnight, the first file arrived. Danny, pharmacist, son of Daniel Reyes, deceased. No criminal record, no debt beyond a modest mortgage, no public entanglements. His life was clean in the way only ordinary lives could be clean, because there was no one paying teams of lawyers to bury the dirt. Victor turned the page and stopped. Matteo Reyes, former maintenance supervisor at Vale Biotech South, died 11 years ago after an industrial accident. Settlement reached out of court. Confidential. For a moment, the office seemed to shrink around him. He read the line twice, then a third time, slower. The legal language was familiar, too familiar. He had signed versions of it himself, or watched someone beneath him sign them. Settlements. Confidentiality. A dead worker turned into a resolved matter. Victor's jaw tightened. He reached for the file box beneath the desk and pulled out an older archive. Its label faded and nearly anonymous among the hundreds of others. His assistants had moved for him over the years. He had never needed to think about that plant again. There had been an accident, a burst line, a bad evening. The kind of incident corporations survived by bleeding money fast enough to make memory inconvenient. But now there was a son who held Evelyn's attention. A son whose father had died under the shadow of the Vale name. Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then, with a calm that had nothing to do with peace, he made a second call. "Pull the original accident report," he said, "and I want the settlement correspondence, unredacted if possible." He listened, then added, "No one is to know this request came from me." When the line went dead, he sat in silence for a long while. If Evelyn was drifting toward the wrong man, then fate had given him a useful irony. She could still be brought back. People always came back when they remembered what they owed. Meanwhile, Evelyn stood in the narrow back room of a small accounting office downtown, pretending to study a spreadsheet while Nora's typing sounded from the other side of the partition. The title on her temporary badge read, Consulting Liaison, which was accurate enough to pass and vague enough to protect her. In this world, she was nobody important. Nobody watched her hands. Nobody lowered their voice when she entered a room. It should have felt like disguise. Instead, it felt like relief. The office smelled faintly of printer ink and rain-damp coats. A paper cup of tea cooled beside her elbow. Through the window she could see the street below, an ordinary stream of people in ordinary clothes, moving through a grey afternoon without bodyguards, without cameras, without the invisible fences of expectation. Daniel had gone to the back room to help a customer who had come in looking for children's fever medicine. Evelyn could hear his voice, low, patient, unhurried. He spoke to people, the way some men offered an umbrella in rain. Without needing thanks, she found herself listening for him more than she meant to. When he returned, he noticed the cup in her hand and smiled a little. "You still haven't drunk that, I was thinking. That usually means you forgot it was there." She looked down and, despite herself, laughed softly, a glamorous sound. It was not the kind of laugh sold at charity galas or printed in magazines. It sounded like someone who had been holding herself together with both hands and finally let one hand loosen. Daniel noticed that too. He leaned a shoulder against the doorway, studying her without intrusion. "You seem tired today." Evelyn gave the answer she had practiced for years. "Long week, that's not an answer. That's a polite curtain." She lifted her gaze to his. "Are you always this observant?" "Only when I'm concerned." Something in her chest shifted at that word. Not interest, not strategy, not curiosity sharpened into advantage. Concern, it was such a simple thing, and so rare that it almost hurt. She looked away first. "I'm fine." Daniel didn't push, he only nodded once, as if accepting the lie for the sake of the moment. "Then stay a little longer. I'm closing soon anyway." When the office finally emptied, he took her somewhere unexpected. It was not a famous place, not a restaurant, not a skyline bar, not one of those private terraces suspended over the city like a trophy. It was a rooftop garden above an aging residential building 3 blocks away. built by neighbors who had turned a forgotten slab of concrete into rows of herbs, tomatoes, climbing vines, and a few stubborn flowers that kept blooming as if they had never received permission to do otherwise. Daniel unlocked the gate with a key tied to a blue string. "You built this?" Evelyn asked. "Not me alone." He stepped aside so she could go in first. People in the building did most of it. One of them used to work in landscaping. Another had a son who loved plants. They wanted a place to breathe. The wind at that height was cool and carried the smell of soil, watered leaves, and city rain. Lights from nearby apartments glowed softly through the early dusk. The garden was modest, but it had the intimacy of things made by hand. A bench with chipped paint, reused planters, string lights someone had woven between metal rails. Evelyn stood very still. For a moment she could not remember the last time she had seen something made without a board meeting. Daniel watched her face. "You look surprised." Am. Why?" She almost said, "Because people usually build for profit, not peace." But that would have revealed too much. Instead, she answered honestly in another way. "Because this is beautiful." He looked around as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time. "It helps." "With what?" "With remembering that not everything has to be useful to matter." The words settled between them. Evelyn walked to the edge of the roof and looked down at the streetlights, coming on one by one. The city turning gold and then dim blue from up here. The towers in the distance no longer looked like power. They looked fragile, almost temporary. "You come here often?" she asked. "Whenever I need to think without hearing myself think." He joined her at the railing, but kept a respectful space between them. "And when I miss my father," the directness of it made her turn toward him. He was not smiling now. He liked places like this, Daniel said. Simple things, air quiet, people who knew their own names. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had not expected grief to surface so quickly in him, nor tenderness in the way he spoke of it. Was he the kind of man who said what he meant? Yes, Daniel's mouth curved faintly, but the sadness remained. Sometimes too much, especially when he thought someone was being cheated. That line carried an old wound. Beneath it, one so quiet it was almost invisible. Evelyn heard it anyway. "He sounds like someone worth remembering." Daniel's eyes held hers. He was the city moved beneath them. Distant traffic murmuring like an ocean behind concrete. Somewhere below, a siren rose and then passed. Evelyn felt her composure thinning at the edges, not from danger but from the dangerous closeness of being understood without armor. "I don't know what it is," she said softly, "but when I'm here, it feels like the noise stops." Daniel's gaze gentled. "You don't get much silence in your life, do you?" "No." She had not meant to answer so quickly, but something in his face made honesty feel less like exposure and more like relief. Daniel looked at her as if he could see the shape of what she did not say. "Then maybe that's why you keep coming back." Evelyn's breath caught. The evening lights had fully come on now, and the garden glowed in small points of warmth around them. A string of bulbs over the railing reflected in her eyes. Daniel noticed that reflection, and for one suspended second, neither of them moved. He lifted his hand, slowly, as though asking permission from the air itself, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was so light it could have been mistaken for wind, yet it stilled her completely. Evelyn looked up at him. He was close enough now that she could see the quiet strain in his expression, the way he was holding himself back with effort. There was no performance in him, no practiced seduction, only an honest hesitation that made her heart ache. "Daniel," she said, though she did not know what she meant to say after his name. He did not answer. He only looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes, as if waiting for the smallest sign that she was willing. The world narrowed to the space between them. He leaned in. So did she, and then sharply her phone rang. The sound cut through the rooftop like a blade. Evelyn flinched so hard she almost stepped back. For one absurd, suspended second, She could only stare at the black screen lighting up in her palm. A corporate emergency number, one she had sworn never to ignore. Daniel's hand fell away at once. He said nothing, but the slight tightening in his jaw was enough to tell her the moment had broken. She stared at the call, breathing unevenly, then looked up at him with an apology she could not yet explain. "I have to take this, I know." His voice was calm, but something in it had dimmed. She answered the call and turned away, listening, as Nora's urgent voice spilled through the line. Something about a board alert, an internal leak, a scheduled meeting that had just changed shape. Evelyn heard the words but not their full meaning. Her attention remained on the warmth that had vanished from the space beside her. When she ended the call, Daniel was already looking out over the city, his expression unreadable. "Trouble?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause, because she could not bear to lie to him fully, "The kind that follows me." He turned back, and there was something very still in his face. "Then maybe you should go." She nodded, though it felt like stepping away from something fragile and newly alive. "I'm sorry, don't be." He tried for a smile, but it did not quite arrive. "Just come back when you can breathe again." The softness of that sentence struck her harder than any demand would have. She left the rooftop with the taste of almost on her lips. Downstairs, the building lobby was dim and quiet. Evelyn was reaching for the front door when Daniel's voice stopped her one last time. "Evelyn." She turned. He looked as though he had not planned to say it aloud. "Whatever is waiting for you out there, I hope it isn't bigger than the part of your life that's yours." She did not know how to answer that, so she only held his gaze for a moment, long enough to promise without words that she had heard him. Then she stepped into the night, halfway down the street, with rain beginning again in a fine silver mist. Daniel paused outside a convenience store to buy bottled water and batteries for the clinic next door. The small television by the counter was already playing the evening broadcast, sound low beneath the clatter of goods being scanned. He barely glanced up at first. Then the anchor's voice sharpened, and the image on the screen changed. Daniel froze, there, framed by the bright studio graphics and the confident seriousness of breaking news, was Evelyn's face beside the headline. "Vale Billionaire Rejects Merger Rumors." For a long moment, Daniel stood inside the convenience store, as if the world had quietly moved away from him. The cashier asked twice whether he wanted a bag. The old refrigerator hummed behind him. Rain tapped against the glass door, making the neon signs outside tremble in red and blue reflections. Everything was ordinary enough to be cruel. On the small television screen, Evelyn Vale looked nothing like the woman who had stood in his apartment with damp hair, holding a chipped mug between both hands, as if warmth were something she had only recently learned to keep. Her face on the news was composed, distant, almost carved from light. The camera loved her the way cities loved skyscrapers. From below, with awe, never close enough to notice loneliness. "Vale Billionaire Rejects Merger Rumors." Daniel read the words again, though they had already burned themselves into him. Billionaire, not executive, not wealthy client, not someone with an important job. She was embarrassed to explain. Billionaire, the woman who had helped him carry medicine crates through rain, who had laughed softly when Mrs. Alvarez scolded him for working too late, who had listened as he spoke of his father with the fragile trust of someone placing a candle in an open window. She was Evelyn Vale. Vale International. The name had sat in the background of his life like a scar no one could see unless they knew where to look. It was printed on old newspaper clippings his mother kept folded inside a tin box. It had appeared in legal responses that spoke of industrial incident and insufficient evidence. It had hovered above hospital bills, funeral flowers, and the kind of silence that settles in a home after the person who used to fix everything is gone. Daniel paid without remembering how much the cashier said. Outside, The rain was no longer mist but thin needles slanting beneath the streetlights. He held the paper bag too tightly, crushing one side of it, while Evelyn's face remained in his mind with the impossible brightness of a lie told perfectly. His phone vibrated before he reached the corner. Evelyn. He watched her name appear, disappear, then appear again. Once, seeing it had made something in him loosen tonight. It felt like a door he did not know whether to open or bolt shut. He let the first call end, then the second. By the third, anger had found its shape, he answered. There was the sound of traffic on her side, muted and distant, as if she were behind thick glass. Daniel, she said, and the relief in her voice made him hate that part of him still recognized it. I can explain. He laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because pain sometimes escaped through the wrong door. Can you? Silence. I was going to tell you. When? His voice stayed low, which frightened him more than shouting would have. After another cup of coffee. After I told you more about my family. After I became useful enough to deserve the truth. That's not what happened. Then what happened? Evelyn Vale. Her full name landed between them, like metal striking stone. He heard her inhale. For the first time since he had known her, Evelyn sounded not poised, not untouchable, but cornered. I didn't approach you because of who you were. I didn't know you, Daniel. That first night at the clinic, I was just trying to get away from everything that came with my name. And I was what? A vacation? A test of ordinary life? A place where no one would ask anything from you, because no one knew you owned half the city. The words were unfair. He knew it even as he said them, but fairness required a calm place inside the heart, and his had filled too quickly with memory. His mother sitting at the kitchen table, with an unopened envelope from a law firm, his father's boots by the door, the name Vale printed at the top of documents that never became answers. Evelyn's voice softened. I hid it, because the moment people know, I stop being a person. I become money, power, rumor, opportunity, blame. I become whatever they need me to be. Daniel closed his eyes beneath the store awning. Rain blew onto his face, cold and clean. Some people don't get to stop being what the world decides either. They just don't have a tower to hide in. The line went quiet. He regretted it and did not regret it. Evelyn said, "You're right." The answer unsettled him more than denial would have. I know wealth protects me, she continued. I know my version of pain comes with drivers, lawyers, locked doors, and people paid to make consequences softer. I'm not asking you to pretend that isn't true, but Daniel, it also means every room I enter has already decided what I should do before I speak. My family, my board, the press, politicians, men who smile like ownership is affection, they all call it duty. Sometimes, I can't tell the difference between being powerful and being trapped. He leaned back against the brick wall. In another life, perhaps he would have listened gently. He would have heard the exhaustion under her words and understood that cages could be made of gold and still leave bruises. But tonight, the gold was all he could see. My father was trapped too, he said, in a factory with locked emergency exits and safety reports no one wanted to read. He felt, rather than heard, her stillness. What did you say? The question was too quiet. Daniel opened his eyes. Across the street, a bus hissed to a stop. People climbed on with umbrellas and tired shoulders. Nothing. No, Daniel. Tell me. He almost did. He almost released the whole buried story into the rain. Daniel Reyes, maintenance supervisor, 48 years old, dead after an explosion at a subcontracted Vale facility 12 years ago. The investigation that dissolved into technicalities. The compensation offer his mother refused, because it came with a confidentiality agreement and an apology written by someone who had never looked them in the eye. But telling her now would make it real between them. It would turn his pain into evidence and her silence into guilt before either of them understood the shape of it. So he said, only, you should go back to your world. Evelyn, it's clearly waiting for you. Daniel, he ended the call. The screen went dark in his hand. For several seconds he stood there, trembling with a rage that had no clean target. Evelyn had lied, or hidden, or protected herself. The difference mattered and did not matter. The result was the same. He had offered truth to someone who had met him wearing a mask. Across the city, Evelyn sat in the back of a black sedan, with her phone still pressed to her ear after the call ended. Nora Lynn, seated beside her with a tablet balanced on her knees, did not speak immediately. She had mastered the rare and loyal art of knowing when silence was not emptiness but shelter. Outside the car window, Vale Tower rose above the financial district, its glass facade catching the storm-lit sky. Evelyn had grown up believing buildings like that meant safety. Her grandfather had called it legacy. Her uncle Victor called it responsibility. Her mother, Margaret, had once stood with Evelyn before the same windows and said nothing at all, only touched the back of her daughter's head with a tenderness. Evelyn had not understood until years later. Now the tower looked less like an empire than a verdict. "The board is already assembled," Nora said gently. "Victor called an emergency session after the broadcast." "Of course he did. And Adrian Blackwell arrived 10 minutes ago." Evelyn turned from the window. "Why?" Nora's expression tightened in the delicate way it did when she was furious but professional. "He told reporters he's here to support you through a sensitive transitional period." A laugh almost escaped Evelyn, but it broke before becoming sound. Sensitive transitional period. Such elegant words for a cage door closing. When she stepped into Vale Tower, cameras flashed from behind the security line. Someone called her name. Another asked whether the merger with Blackwell Holdings would include a personal announcement. Evelyn walked forward without slowing, her coat darkened by rain at the shoulders, her face calm because calm had been trained into her so deeply, it sometimes arrived before feeling. In the private elevator, Nora reached out and adjusted the damp edge of Evelyn's sleeve. It was a small gesture, almost maternal, and for one dangerous second Evelyn wanted to lean into it and admit that she was tired. Instead, she said, "No one is to contact Daniel." Nora's fingers paused. "Victor may already have someone looking into him." Evelyn looked at her. "Then make sure we know before they do." The boardroom on the top floor was lit too brightly. Rain streaked down the windows behind the long table, turning the city into moving shadow. The directors sat in their usual places, grey suits and careful expressions. People who knew how to make fear sound like prudence. Victor Vale stood near the head of the table, silver-haired, elegant sorrow arranged on his face like an expensive tie. Adrian Blackwell sat beside him, though no one had invited him to that chair. He rose when Evelyn entered, handsome in the polished, political way of men who had never doubted their welcome. "Evelyn," Adrian said, warm enough for witnesses, "you shouldn't have had to face the media alone. I didn't ask you to face anything with me." A flicker crossed his eyes, quickly hidden by a smile not yet. Several board members glanced at one another. Victor lowered his gaze, almost as though burdened by her rudeness. Evelyn walked to her seat but did not sit. This emergency meeting had better concern company operations, not gossip. Victor folded his hands. "Public confidence is company operation, and my personal life is not public property." Adrian gave a soft sigh, pitched perfectly to sound patient. "No one wants to take anything from you, Evelyn, but the market dislikes uncertainty. Our families have discussed alignment for years. A formal engagement would stabilize sentiment before the annual vote." The word engagement moved around the room not as a proposal, but as a strategy already approved. Evelyn felt something cold settle inside her. It was not fear. Fear was quick, with a pulse. This was older. This was the sensation of becoming 12 years old again, sitting outside closed doors while adults decided where she would study, what she would inherit, how long she could grieve. "No," she said. Victor's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Perhaps this is not the time for impulsive declarations. There is nothing impulsive about refusing to marry a balance sheet. A director near the end cleared his throat. Chairwoman Vale, recent behavior has raised concerns, unscheduled absences, missed calls during negotiation windows. Now a public contradiction of a potential alliance. We must ask whether you are under unusual emotional strain. There it was, not disobedience, instability, a cleaner word, a more useful knife. Evelyn placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. If a man refuses a merger, he has strategic discipline. If I refuse a marriage disguised as one, I'm emotionally unstable. No one answered. Adrian's voice lowered. This isn't about gender, it's about judgment. You've been seen in neighborhoods that invite speculation, with people who may not understand the consequences of proximity to you. Daniel's face rose in her mind, pale beneath the convenience store lights, hurt turning slowly into contempt. Evelyn looked at Adrian. Say his name if you mean him. For the first time, Adrian's smile thinned. Victor stepped in before he could respond. We are trying to protect you, her uncle said. Your mother understood sacrifice. She knew the Vale name must come before personal desire. The room disappeared for half a heartbeat. Her mother's name had always been Victor's sharpest weapon because he wrapped it in mourning before he struck. Margaret Vale, dead before she could explain all the silences she left behind. Margaret, whose portrait watched the lobby with gentle eyes, while men used her memory to demand obedience from her daughter. Evelyn straightened. Do not use my mother to sell me. Victor's face hardened just enough for Evelyn to know she had wounded him where pride lived. Good. She was tired of being the only one bleeding politely. The meeting dissolved after that into formal language. Review committees, advisory recommendations, shareholder optics, contingency authority. Evelyn heard the meaning beneath every phrase. If she did not comply, they would question her capacity. If she chose a man outside their world, they would make him evidence against her. If she insisted on being human, they would call it weakness. When she finally left the boardroom, Nora followed her into the corridor. I'll pull everything on Blackwell's pressure campaign, Nora said, and Victor's communications. Evelyn nodded, then stopped near the glass wall overlooking the city. Below, thousands of lights burned in apartments, clinics, shops, restaurants closing for the night. Somewhere down there, Daniel was hating her. Somewhere down there, perhaps he had every right. I didn't tell him, Evelyn whispered. Nora's gaze softened. About who you were, about how afraid I was that if he knew, he'd look at me the way everyone else does. And did he? Evelyn looked at her reflection in the dark glass. A woman worth billions, unable to buy back one honest evening. Worse, he looked at me as if I had become the thing that hurt him. Nora did not ask what that meant. Perhaps she already knew there were old files in every empire, rooms no one opened because dust was easier to manage than truth. Much later, Daniel returned to the small apartment above the pharmacy. The batteries sat unopened on the kitchen counter. The bottled water left a damp ring on the table. He removed his jacket, then put it back on because the room felt suddenly too still, too full of all the things he had almost shared with Evelyn. His mother's tin box was in the bottom cabinet, behind spare towels and a broken heater part he kept meaning to throw away. He took it out and sat on the floor like he had as a boy after the funeral, when adults forgot children could read grief, even if they could not read legal documents. Inside were old clippings, faded photographs, his father's employee badge from Ria's Industrial Maintenance, and a letter from a law office expressing sympathy without admitting fault. Vale International was not printed on every page. That had always been part of the cruelty. It hid behind subsidiaries, contractors, operational partners, names that changed when blame came near. But his mother had known. His father had known too. On the last voicemail Daniel Reyes ever left, he had said, "If anything happens, Look at who signed the safety waiver. Daniel had never found the signature. A knock came at the door. He froze. It was too late for neighbors and too soft for emergency. He stood, crossed the room, and looked through the peephole. No one. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, except for a large cream envelope lying on the worn mat at his feet. No stamp, no return address, only his name written in black ink. Daniel Reyes. His pulse began to beat in his throat. He picked it up slowly, shut the door, and placed the envelope on the table as if it might burn him. For a full minute he only stared at it. Then he tore it open. Documents slid out across the wood. Copies of internal memos, inspection reports. Photographs from an industrial site he recognized from nightmares more than memory. A safety complaint marked unresolved. A payment authorization routed through a Vale subsidiary. And there, on the final page, was a name he had heard all his life in courtrooms, broadcasts, and his mother's bitter silences. Vale International. Daniel's hands turned cold. At the bottom of the page, beneath a paragraph approving continued operations, despite hazardous conditions, was a signature, not Evelyn's, but close enough to her world to drag her into the center of his grief. Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, with the documents spread in front of him, the yellow light from the ceiling making. The papers look even harsher than they were. Every page seemed to breathe the same old poison. Dates, warnings, signatures, sealed decisions made in rooms he had never entered by people who would never have to stand in the dust they created. He read the reports again and again, as if repetition might soften the blow. It did not. By dawn, anger had settled into something colder, not the kind that burned and shouted, but the kind that stayed quiet and changed the shape of a man from the inside. He thought of his father's hands, rough and always smelling faintly of soap and metal from the pharmacy sink. He thought of the cough that had worsened in the final years, the way Matteo had smiled through pain so Daniel would not learn to fear it too early. There had been no grand ending, only a body worn down by things nobody had admitted were happening. And now there was paper proof that someone had known. Evelyn did not answer his first call. That hurt more than he expected. It made him feel foolish for how quickly he had begun to trust her silence, her careful eyes, the way she listened as if his words mattered more than her own thoughts. He told himself the delay meant nothing. She was busy. She was probably with people who lived in rooms where emergencies wore silk and spoke in legal language. When she finally called back, her voice was tense, as though she had been holding herself together by force. Daniel. He closed his eyes at the sound of her saying his name. "Did you read it?" he asked. Yes, a pause. In that pause, he could hear the faint hum of an office, the controlled stillness of her world. "Then you know why I needed to speak to you," she said. He looked down at the documents. "I know what your company's name says. I know what the reports say. And I know what my father's grave says. I don't need a polished explanation. Daniel, I didn't know." The words came softly, but they landed badly. Too softly, too much like innocence. Too much like the kind of sentence people with power used when consequences had already been passed down to everyone else. "Didn't know," he repeated. "That's convenient." Her breathing shifted. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." "No," he said, and his voice had gone dry. "You're asking me to believe that ignorance matters. It doesn't. Not when people died." There was no quick defense after that. Only silence, and in it he felt the strange, painful fact that he wanted her to hurt, not because he hated her, but because he needed proof that she stood on the same ground as him now. If she could feel it, if the documents could pierce through her polished life, then maybe his father's death would not remain one more thing buried beneath wealth. "I'm coming to you," Evelyn said at last. He laughed once, without humor. "Why?" "To apologize in person." "To understand," she said. "And because I believe you deserve that much." He almost told her not to come. almost told her there was no version of this conversation that could stay civilized. But some tired part of him, the part that still remembered the warmth of her hand in his, and the quiet way she had looked at him, as if he were not invisible, could not stop her. When she arrived, she was not wearing the armor he was used to seeing in photographs. No press-perfect suit, no cold necklace flashing at her throat, just a dark coat, her hair pinned back hastily, her face bare of all the expensive distance the world usually placed around her. She stood in his doorway like someone entering a room where she had no right to be. His apartment looked smaller beside her, and he hated that he noticed it. She glanced at the documents on the table, then at him. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. She took in the room in one slow sweep. The old sofa, the modest shelves, the framed photograph of Matteo on the wall, smiling beside a stack of books outside the pharmacy. Her eyes lingered there for 1 second too long. "I should have known this would end here," Daniel said. "I didn't come to defend the company." "Then why are you here?" "To find out who signed off on this," she said, "and why my family hid it from me." He studied her face, looking for performance, for some private advantage, some thread that would reveal that this was still business to her. But what he found instead was strain, the kind that comes when a person discovers that the foundations beneath her life have been tampered with. "You really didn't know?" He said no. Her voice tightened. "And if I had known, I would have looked for it before now." He almost said that before now was exactly the problem. Instead, he picked up the documents and handed them to her one by one. Their fingers touched briefly, and the contact made both of them still. Evelyn read in silence. The room became very quiet around her, as if even the air was waiting. When she reached the inspection report with the unresolved complaint, her jaw set. When she found the internal memo authorizing continued operations despite the hazard warnings, her hand curled around the edge of the page until it bent. "This is archived," she said. "Yes, and some of these pages are missing context." "They're missing lives," he replied. The words came out harder than he intended. She flinched just slightly, and he saw then that he was not punishing a corporation. He was wounding a woman who had not yet learned how much of her family's history was made of the same violence as everyone else's. That did not excuse her. It only made him feel more complicated. And he hated complication because grief had never been complicated for him. Grief was simple. It was a chair left empty, a voice that would not answer, a father who had been made to breathe poison so that someone else could sign an expansion deal. Evelyn put the pages down and lifted her eyes to his. "Take me to the truth," she said. He wanted to refuse her. Instead, he heard himself say, "If I do, there's no going back. I'm already there." That night, she went back to Vale International alone, not as chairwoman at a gala or a public face for a camera, but as a woman moving through the building after most of it had emptied out. Nora Lynn waited for her near the records floor, carrying a slim tablet and the expression of someone who had long ago learned not to waste time on shock. "You look like you haven't slept," Nora said. "I haven't." Nora's eyes flicked to the folder in Evelyn's hand. So it was real. It was worse than real. Nora did not ask what she meant. She simply swiped her access card, led Evelyn through a side corridor and into a storage room most employees probably believed no longer existed. Rows of boxed board minutes lined the shelves in careful grey stacks. Some were marked for destruction, but never destroyed. That alone made Evelyn's stomach tighten. "I found discrepancies months ago," Nora said quietly. "Small ones at first, missing approvals, duplicate file numbers, reports that were rescanned with different timestamps. I wasn't sure anyone would listen." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Nora gave her a direct look. "Because your uncle would have buried it before you finished saying his name." The name Victor seemed to darken the room. Evelyn moved to the nearest shelf and began pulling out files, one after another. Board minutes from years ago, safety committee notes, revision logs, annexes with empty spaces where pages should have been. The pattern was unmistakable once she saw it, and that made it worse. This was not chaos, it was precision. Someone had removed evidence carefully, line by line, like a surgeon cutting out the heart of a story. Here, Nora said, pointing to one page in a thick ledger. This version was filed in the General Archive. This one was recovered from the backup copy. Evelyn compared them. The words were similar, but not identical. One reported operational adjustment. The other, the original, included a sentence crossed out in black ink and replaced by a milder phrase that made the danger disappear. Her fingers went cold. They changed the safety language, she whispered. Yes. And this one. She held up a memo with a red stamp. Nora hesitated only a moment. That one was routed through your uncle's office before the final vote. Evelyn's pulse beat painfully in her ears. She saw it then, not the single incident Daniel had brought to her, but the architecture of it, the pressure, the convenience, the invisible mathematics of profit. Workers reduced to acceptable losses, while an expansion deal moved forward, because the numbers looked cleaner than the truth. For the first time in her life, she felt disgust toward the family name she had carried like inheritance. In the silence, Nora said, "There's something else." Evelyn looked up. Your mother reviewed part of the settlement file herself. The room shifted around that sentence. My mother was already sick by then, Evelyn said. Nora nodded. Which is why I think she may have signed without seeing everything, or she may have seen enough to try to stop it and been overruled. Evelyn reached for the final folder with a careful, almost frightened hand. The label on the cover was faded, the corners soft from being handled too many times. Settlement approval. Her throat tightened as she opened it. Inside were copies of compensation agreements, legal notices, and a final page clipped to the back with a silver pin. The page was creased along the middle, as if it had been folded and unfolded in private too often. Evelyn scanned the lines without breathing. Then she saw the signature, her mother's Margaret Vale, clear, elegant, unmistakable. For a long moment Evelyn could only stare at it, the paper trembling faintly in her hand. She had spent years believing her mother's silence had been a kind of weakness, a gentle retreat from the brutality of the family empire. But this signature was not silence. It was the shape of a decision, or the evidence of a betrayal. She could not yet tell which hurt more. And because the past had finally opened its mouth, Evelyn understood that nothing between her and Daniel would remain untouched. The ink of Margaret Vale's name seemed darker than the rest of the page, as if it had absorbed all the years Evelyn had spent trusting it. For a while, she did not move. Outside the archive room, Vale International continued to breathe through polished glass and steel. Elevators carried executives upward. Phones rang behind frosted doors. Somewhere, someone was probably speaking her name in a meeting with the careful respect reserved for a woman no one truly knew. The world she ruled did not pause because her childhood had cracked open in her hands. Nora stood beside her without speaking. That was one of Nora's rare gifts. She knew silence could be a kind of protection when words would only bruise. Evelyn lowered herself into the leather chair by the table. Her knees had not failed, not exactly. Evelyn Vale did not collapse. She had trained herself too well for that. But the strength that had carried her through hostile acquisitions, shareholder revolts, and years of public scrutiny suddenly felt borrowed, thin, unable to support the weight of one signature. My mother hated these kinds of settlements, Evelyn said at last. Her voice sounded strangely calm, almost detached. She used to say, money could apologize for damage, but it could never erase it. Nora's eyes softened. Then maybe she didn't sign it willingly. Evelyn looked down again. Margaret's handwriting curved across the line with graceful certainty. When Evelyn was young, she used to watch her mother sign birthday cards in the same hand. Margaret never rushed her writing. Even thank you notes were written as if the recipient mattered. What if she did? Evelyn whispered. What if compassion was only something she gave me because she could afford to perform it at home? Nora flinched slightly, not from the accusation, but from the pain beneath it. Evelyn closed the folder. The sound was small, but it seemed to end something. By the time she left the archive room, the morning had hardened into afternoon. Sunlight fell through the high windows of the executive floor in clean, expensive rectangles. Her reflection moved along the glass walls beside her. Black suit, pale face, mouth controlled into a line. She looked like herself. That was the most frightening part. Devastation, she discovered, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it wore lipstick and walked into a boardroom on time. Victor Vale was waiting in her office. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking over the city as if it were a chessboard his family had purchased long ago. He did not turn immediately when she entered. That delay was deliberate. Victor had always understood the uses of theatre. "You found the old files," he said. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the folder. "You knew they existed." "Of course I knew." He finally faced her. His silver hair was immaculate, his expression grave rather than defensive. That was Victor's skill. He made control look like burden. "I hoped you would never have to see them." "Did my mother sign this?" Victor glanced at the folder, then at her. "Evelyn, did she sign it?" He sighed, not like a guilty man, but like a man grieving the innocence of someone younger. "Your mother loved people, sometimes too much." She thought, if she approved the settlements quickly, the families could survive without years of litigation. She believed exposure would destroy the company, and with it, thousands of livelihoods. Evelyn heard the words. They were reasonable. That made them more dangerous. The report says safety concerns were raised before the accident. Concerns are raised in every factory, every month, in every industrial division in the world, Victor replied. You know this. Risk does not always become negligence. And Daniel Reyes, Victor's eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. The pharmacist's father, the way he said it stripped Daniel's grief into a detail. Evelyn felt heat rise behind her eyes. His name was Mateo, she said. He was a man. Victor's face softened again carefully. Yes, and his death was tragic. But tragedy is not always a crime. Be careful, Evelyn. Guilt can make you generous, but it can also make you reckless. She wanted to throw the folder onto the desk, to demand every truth, to tear the past apart until something clean appeared. But Victor stepped closer before she could speak, lowering his voice with the intimacy of family. There is a reason I have been pushing the Blackwell Alliance. Adrian's family has political reach, legal insulation, media influence. If these old documents surface now, without context, Vale International will be accused before it is heard. Plants will close, pensions will bleed. People who had nothing to do with decisions made 15 years ago will pay for your moral confusion. The phrase struck her like a slap dressed as concern. My moral confusion, yes, Victor held her gaze. Because you are confusing personal affection with public duty. Daniel's face appeared in her mind with cruel suddenness. His sleeves rolled at the pharmacy counter. His quiet smile when an elderly customer forgot her wallet. The coat he had put around Evelyn's shoulders in the rain, before he knew her last name could move markets. Personal affection, Victor called it, as if the one place she had been treated like a human being was an indulgence. Victor continued, You think that young man sees you, perhaps he does, but he also sees your name, your company, his father's death. Eventually love will become an accusation. It already has, hasn't it? Evelyn said nothing. That was answer enough. Victor placed a cream-colored envelope on her desk. The paper was thick, embossed with the Blackwell crest. Adrian will announce the engagement after the charity gala. If you agree, it will stabilize everything. The board will rally. Investors will calm. Any attempt to weaponize the past can be contained. Contained, Evelyn repeated softly. Protected, Victor corrected. But Evelyn had lived long enough among powerful people to know how often those words shared a spine. That evening, rain returned to the city. It had a way of making distance visible. From the back seat of her car, Evelyn watched umbrellas bloom along the sidewalks, black and navy, and cheap transparent plastic. People hurried past cafes, bus stops, pharmacies. Lives brushed against one another and disappeared. Daniel had not answered her last 2 calls. She had told herself she understood. Then she had told herself she did not deserve to be understood. Neither thought gave her peace. When the car stopped across from Reyes, community pharmacy, the sign was already dimmed for closing. Through the window, she saw Daniel moving behind the counter, counting receipts with the tired precision of someone who preferred tasks to thoughts. His younger assistant said something to him, and Daniel nodded, but his face did not change. Evelyn stepped out before her driver could open the door. The rain touched her hair, her coat. The folder tucked beneath her arm. She did not carry the documents inside, not yet. She carried something simpler, more unbearable. Daniel's grey coat folded neatly over her arm. The bell above the pharmacy door gave a soft chime. Daniel looked up. For one suspended moment, the world held its breath around them. Shelves of medicine stood in quiet rows. The faint scent of antiseptic and herbal lozenges floated in the warm air. This was where he belonged, Evelyn thought with a sudden ache. Not because it was small, but because everything here had a purpose that could be named. The assistant quickly excused herself to the back room. Daniel's eyes moved to the coat in Evelyn's arms. "You didn't have to bring it yourself," he said. "I know." She placed it carefully on the counter. The gesture felt too formal, too final, so she kept her hand resting on the fabric for 1 extra second, as if warmth might still be stored there. Daniel did not reach for it. Evelyn drew a breath. "I found documents today, about the accident, about the settlements." His face tightened, but he remained still. "There's a signature," she continued. "My mother's. I don't know yet what it means. I don't know if she approved the cover-up, or if someone used her name, or if she thought she was protecting people. I don't know enough to ask you for anything." The smallest muscle moved in Daniel's jaw. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the glass. Evelyn looked at him then, fully, without the protection of chairwoman, or heiress, or wounded daughter. "I came because I didn't want my silence to become another lie between us." Daniel's gaze dropped to the coat. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "My father used to say debt isn't always money. Sometimes it's gratitude forced on people who were never given a choice." Evelyn's throat tightened. "He accepted the settlement because my mother was scared," Daniel said. "Because the lawyers told her it was generous. Because grief makes poor people practical in ways rich people later call consent." There was no cruelty in his voice. That made it harder to bear. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "I know you are." Those 4 words were tender, and yet they did not absolve her. Perhaps that was why they hurt so much. Daniel finally picked up the coat, but he held it loosely, as if it no longer belonged to either of them. "The night I gave you this, I thought you were just someone who looked cold." "I was," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. Evelyn felt the tears then, close but not falling. "With you, I didn't feel like a name people wanted something from." Daniel's expression flickered for a second. Love rose between them with the old helplessness. It was still there. That was the tragedy. Betrayal would have been cleaner if it had killed everything. "I loved that part of you," he said. "The woman who drank terrible vending machine coffee and pretended not to hate it. The woman who listened when Mrs. Alvarez talked about her grandson for 20 minutes. The woman who looked surprised whenever someone did something kind without wanting a favor." Evelyn tried to smile, but it broke before it formed. "But love without truth," Daniel continued, "is only another form of debt, and I can't owe your family forgiveness just because I love you." She nodded slowly. There were sentences a person could survive only by accepting them. I won't ask that of you, she said. Not now, not ever. The bell chimed again as a customer entered, then paused awkwardly at the sight of them. Daniel stepped back, becoming once more the pharmacist, the steady man behind the counter. Evelyn recognized the kindness of that distance. He was giving her a way to leave before pain became spectacle. She turned toward the door. Evelyn, he said. She stopped. Daniel's voice was softer now. Don't protect me from the truth because you're afraid I'll hate you. That would hurt more. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she did not look back, because if she did, she might walk toward him instead of out into the rain. By the time Evelyn returned to the penthouse, the Blackwell envelope was waiting on her dining table. Victor must have sent another copy, or perhaps it had been there all along, brought by a messenger while she was learning how love could stand in front of her and still be out of reach. She removed the engagement proposal from the envelope. Adrian Blackwell's name sat beside hers in elegant print, already arranged for public consumption. There were schedules, gala notes, press strategies, contingency language for reputational risk. Her future had been formatted into bullet points by people who believed obedience was a kind of elegance. Evelyn stood by the window until the city blurred into rain and light. Protecting the empire had always been presented to her as the highest form of love. Love for her mother's legacy. Love for employees. Love for the family name. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered whether the empire had survived not because it deserved protection, but because everyone decent within it had been persuaded that truth was too expensive. Her phone vibrated. Nora. Evelyn answered without speaking. On the other end, Nora's breath came fast, not panicked, but charged with discovery. Evelyn, I stayed in the archive. There was something odd about the settlement folder. The spine had been resealed. Evelyn turned from the window. What did you find? A storage chip hidden inside the binding. It's old but still readable. Nora paused, and in that pause Evelyn felt the entire past lean closer. There's an audio file on it. Evelyn's hand tightened around the phone. Nora's voice lowered. It's labeled, "For Evelyn when the truth comes." The old storage chip looked almost weightless in Nora's palm. But when Evelyn arrived at the private archive room beneath Vale Tower, she felt as if she were walking towards something heavy enough to split her life in two. The archive smelled of paper, dust, and refrigerated air. Rows of sealed boxes stood in the dim light like silent witnesses that had waited too long. Nora had not gone home. Her hair was pinned carelessly now, and there was a faint red mark across her wrist, where a file strap had pressed into her skin. For years, Nora had been the kind of assistant who made impossibility look orderly. Tonight, for the first time, she looked afraid of what order had been hiding. I made a copy, Nora said quietly, offline. No network, no cloud. Evelyn nodded. She wanted to praise her, thank her, ask if she was all right. But the words stayed somewhere behind her ribs. On the desk between them sat a small recorder, a laptop disconnected from every system, and a pair of headphones. Nora hesitated before handing them over. You don't have to listen alone. But some griefs had doors only one person could open. Evelyn put on the headphones. At first there was static, a dry, old sound like rain falling inside a wall. Then a cough, a breath, and then her mother's voice. Not the public voice archived in memorial videos, calm and polished, speaking about innovation and duty beneath perfect lighting. This voice was tired, close, human. Evelyn, my darling, Margaret Vale said, and the tenderness of it struck Evelyn, so suddenly that her eyes burned before she could prepare herself. If you are hearing this, then the truth has survived at least one coward. Evelyn stopped breathing. Nora looked away, giving her privacy, but did not leave the room. Margaret continued. The North Calder facility was unsafe. I knew it. The preliminary safety audit confirmed it. The Eastern pressure system failed 3 stress simulations, and the maintenance reports were altered before they reached the board. I refused to approve continued operation. A faint scrape sounded in the recording, as if papers were being moved. Victor told me a temporary shutdown would damage the company beyond repair, he said. Thousands of workers would suffer if we lost the contracts. The senior directors agreed with him. They called it a manageable risk. Her mother's voice trembled, not from weakness, but from fury held in discipline. There is no such thing as a manageable risk when other people are asked to pay for it with their lives. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. North Calder. Daniel's father had worked there. Daniel Reyes had died in the accident that Vale International had called tragic, unforeseeable, and swiftly compensated. I prepared a statement, Margaret said. I intended to go to the regulators myself. I sent copies of the original audit to 3 places, but I no longer know whom I can trust. Victor has begun intercepting my correspondence. If anything happens to me before I can make this public, find the audit. Find Leonard Cross. He was the original auditor. He refused to sign the revised report. Evelyn closed her eyes. Leonard Cross. The name cut through the static like a blade. A pause followed. In it, Margaret's breath grew uneven. I became ill before I could act. Too ill, they said, to attend meetings. Too ill to understand consequences. Yet somehow, after I was confined to bed, documents appeared bearing my signature. Approvals I never gave. Settlements I never authorized. Evelyn, if they show you my name and tell you, I chose silence, do not believe them. The room seemed to tilt for half her life. Evelyn had carried her mother's legacy like a sacred instruction. Victor had placed it in her hands with practiced sorrow. Your mother believed in protecting the company. Your mother understood sacrifice. Your mother would have wanted you to be strong. But her mother's own voice now rose out of the grave and broke the leash. Power is not the right to survive at any cost, Margaret said. It is the burden of making sure others do not pay for your survival. If I failed, then let my failure end with me. Do not inherit my silence. Inherit my conscience. The recording ended with a small click. For a long time, Evelyn did not remove the headphones. She had imagined truth as something sharp, something that would wound her pride or clarify her guilt. She had not imagined it would sound like a mother apologizing in the dark. When she finally pulled the headphones away, the archive room was unbearably quiet. Nora's eyes were wet, though she tried to hide it by looking at the laptop. Evelyn, he used her. Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, too calm. Beneath it, something was collapsing with terrible precision. Nora did not ask who they both knew. He used her name, her illness, her death. He taught me to obey a ghost he had edited. Outside the archive, Vale Tower rose above the city with its glass, marble and clean lines, a monument to confidence. Evelyn wondered how much of its beauty had been polished over fear. How many boardroom smiles had sat comfortably atop forged signatures. How many years Victor had watched her bow, her head before her mother's portrait, knowing the truth he had buried beneath it. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The city looked washed and innocent, which felt like an insult. Evelyn did not go to the chairman's office. She left through the lower garage with Nora beside her and drove herself across town, away from towers and private elevators, toward a neighborhood where pharmacies opened early because ordinary people needed medicine before work. Daniel was unlocking the metal gate when he saw her. He looked thinner than he had days ago, though perhaps pain had simply made her notice the hollows beneath his eyes. His hand paused on the lock. For a moment, neither of them moved. Between them stood everything unsaid. Her surname, his father's death, the kiss that had once felt simple, the accusation that had made them strangers again. I know it's early, Evelyn said. Daniel's gaze moved over her face. She had not slept. She had not repaired her makeup. There was nothing polished left for him to resent. If this is about Vale, It's about my mother, she said then, after a breath, and your father. The hardness in him did not vanish, it had been earned. But something in his expression shifted. A door not opening, only unlocking, he let her inside. The pharmacy still held the quiet warmth she remembered. Shelves neatly arranged, the faint scent of antiseptic and mint, a paper cup of coffee sitting beside the register. Once, this place had made her feel anonymous in the gentlest way. Now she stood among its ordinary fluorescent lights, carrying a secret large enough to ruin an empire. She placed the recorder on the counter. "I need you to hear this," she said, "and I need you to know I didn't come to ask for forgiveness." Daniel looked at the recorder as if it were alive. "What are you asking for?" "The truth," Evelyn said, "even if it destroys me." He stared at her for a long moment, then pressed play. Listening to Margaret's voice a second time hurt differently. The first time, Evelyn had been a daughter. This time, she was standing beside a son. Daniel did not interrupt. His face remained still through the beginning. But when Margaret named the failed pressure system, his jaw tightened. When she mentioned altered maintenance reports, his hand closed around the edge of the counter. And when she said Leonard Cross had refused to sign the revised report, Daniel lowered his head. Evelyn saw then that grief did not always cry out. Sometimes it became perfectly quiet, because if it made one sound, it would not stop. The recording ended. Behind them, the refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a bus sighed at the curb. Daniel spoke without looking at her. "My mother used to say my father came home angry that week. Not scared. Angry he told her something was wrong at the plant. He said men in offices were gambling with men on the floor." Evelyn's throat closed. "I was 15, Daniel continued. "After the accident, Vale sent flowers, a letter, a settlement check. My mother folded the letter and put it in a drawer. She never cashed the check." "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered. He gave a faint, broken laugh, but there was no cruelty in it. "I thought your family bought silence. I thought you inherited that silence and called it leadership." "So did I," she said. That made him look at her. Evelyn met his eyes, because if she looked away now, she would become everything she hated. "I don't know how much damage my decisions have caused since then. I don't know how many times I protected something because I believed it was my mother's wish. But I know this. Victor forged her signature, he buried the audit, and he used her memory to make me obedient." For the first time since the truth had begun to surface, Daniel looked at her not as Evelyn Vale, chairwoman of the company that had swallowed his father's life, but as Evelyn, a woman whose grief had been trained into a weapon against herself. His anger did not disappear. Love was not magic. It did not erase the dead or absolve the living. But his voice softened when he said, "You were betrayed too." The words entered her more deeply than comfort. She had not allowed herself that sentence. It felt almost dangerous, because if she admitted she had been betrayed, she would also have to admit she had been loved by a mother who had tried to stop the harm. Evelyn's eyes filled. She looked down. Daniel came around the counter slowly, giving her enough time to step back if she needed to. She did not. When his hand touched her shoulder, it was not an embrace yet, not forgiveness, not a return to what they had been. It was simply contact, human, steady, undeserved, and necessary. "We find Leonard Cross," he said. Evelyn nodded. "If he still has the original audit, we can prove the negligence and the forgery. And if he doesn't, then we find where my mother sent the copies." Daniel's expression darkened. "Victor won't let you." "No," Evelyn said, "he won't." By noon, Nora had built a search around every mention of Leonard Cross in archived contractor records, pension transfers, licensing boards, and old regulator correspondence. The man had vanished 14 years ago. No forwarding address, no public employment, no lawsuits, no obituary. People with clean lives left traces. People who disappeared either feared something or were paid well enough to become ghosts. Evelyn returned to Vale Tower for one reason only: access. The building greeted her with familiar obedience. Employees stepped aside, greeted her respectfully, pretended not to notice the rumors tightening in the air. A chairwoman's absence was never just an absence. It was a market signal, a board concern, a weakness waiting to be priced. Adrian Blackwell was waiting outside her office, as if he belonged there. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression of elegant impatience. To the world, Adrian represented stability. Political connections, old money, clean philanthropy, an alliance that would calm shareholders and please families who believed marriage was another form of merger. To Evelyn today, he looked like a locked door smiling. "You look exhausted," he said. "Then this is not a good time." He followed her inside anyway. "That depends on whether you still understand timing." Evelyn set her bag on the desk. "Say what you came to say." Adrian's gaze moved to the city beyond her windows. "There are whispers about North Calder, about your uncle, about files being pulled from archives at strange hours." He turned back to her. "Whatever emotional crusade you're considering, end it." The coldness in his voice was not anger, it was calculation. "My family had interests tied to those contracts," he said. "So did half the people you need on your side. You expose this publicly, you will not be applauded for courage. You will be removed for recklessness. If crimes were committed crimes." Adrian cut in softly. "Be careful with that word. It rarely lands on only one man, it spreads directors, partners, regulators, investors. Your mother's name, your company's value, thousands of employees whose pensions depend on the stock you may collapse." There it was again, the old altar. Truth placed on one side, innocent livelihoods on the other, as if conscience were always selfish and silence always practical. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "And Daniel?" Adrian's mouth tightened at the name. "Love will not protect you when shareholders turn against you." "No," she said. "But power has not protected anyone worth protecting either." For the first time, the smoothness slipped from his face. "You think choosing him makes you free," Adrian said. "It makes you vulnerable, and vulnerable people get handled. Is that a warning?" "It's advice," he replied, walking toward the door. "For a woman who is running out of allies." After he left, Evelyn stood alone in her office, surrounded by awards, acquisitions, and framed magazine covers calling her unstoppable. She had never felt less certain. Not because Adrian frightened her, but because part of what he said was true. The proof that could free her mother's name could also destroy everything Margaret had built, everything Evelyn had inherited, everything thousands depended on. Truth was not clean. It did not arrive with gentle hands. It asked who was willing to bleed first. That evening, Nora's call came while Evelyn was still at her desk and Daniel was on speaker from the pharmacy office. "I found him," Nora said. Evelyn sat up. Daniel went silent. Leonard Cross renewed a professional certification 6 years ago under a different name. Nora continued. "Leonard Crane. Same birth date, same university record, 1 digit altered in the old tax file. He's been living in a coastal town 2 hours north. Small apartment over a closed bait shop." Evelyn's heart began to pound. "Send the address. We leave now." "I already did," Nora said. "But Evelyn." The hesitation chilled her. "What?" "I also flagged local traffic cameras around the building, just in case someone else was watching him." Nora's voice thinned. 10 minutes ago, 2 black SUVs stopped outside his apartment. Daniel's chair scraped sharply through the phone. Evelyn stood grabbing her coat. "Police?" No plates." Visible 4 men went inside. Evelyn was already moving toward the elevator, Daniel's voice urgent in her ear. "Evelyn, wait for me." But the next words from Nora froze both of them. "They're coming out now," she whispered. "They have an older man with them. His hands are tied." Evelyn reached the elevator as the doors opened to her reflection. Pale, composed, terrified. On Nora's screen, miles away, The last living witness to her mother's truth was dragged into the back of an unmarked car and disappeared into the darkening road before Evelyn could reach him. For the first time in years, Evelyn Vale understood the difference between command and responsibility. Command was easy. She had been trained for it since childhood. Sign here, approve this acquisition, silence that scandal, sit at the head of a polished table while people twice her age waited for permission to breathe. Command was a language her family spoke fluently. It did not require tenderness. It did not ask whether anyone was afraid. Responsibility was different. Responsibility was the sound of Nora's voice trembling over the line while an old man was taken from a coastal apartment. It was Daniel running down the service stairs behind her because the elevator was too slow, his coat half-buttoned, his face pale but resolute. It was Evelyn realizing that all her money, all her access, all the systems that had once made her feel imprisoned could, in this moment, become a shield. Not a throne, not a weapon, a shield. By the time they reached the underground garage, Evelyn was no longer moving like a frightened woman. Fear had not disappeared. It had simply been folded neatly inside her, where she kept all dangerous things. She called people she had not used in years, not the glossy executives who smiled for annual reports, but the quiet ones, the former prosecutor who now ran crisis legal strategy, the private security director who had once protected humanitarian witnesses overseas, the retired judge who had owed Margaret Vale a favor and had never forgotten it. Her voice was calm enough to frighten everyone who heard it. "I need a vehicle tracked without alerting local police dispatch," she said, sliding into the back of the car. Unmarked black SUVs leaving North Harbor Road, likely toward inland routes. No confrontation unless life is at immediate risk. "I want legal observers on standby and a protection detail prepared for extraction." Daniel got in beside her. Rain dotted his hair. He looked at her not with suspicion this time, but with something more complicated. He was watching a world he had once distrusted open around him, like hidden machinery beneath a city street. Evelyn ended the call and turned to him. "You don't have to come." He almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You always say that when it's too late for me to leave, this could become dangerous. It was dangerous before you admitted it." The car surged out into the evening, leaving the tower behind in a blur of glass and lights. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the city loosened into industrial blocks, then into wet highways lined with dark pines. Evelyn's phone lit again and again. Nora sent traffic stills, route predictions, satellite maps, a timestamp from a gas station camera. The SUVs had split for 15 minutes. Then one had reappeared near a rural medical access road, a clinic. Too small to be a hospital, too far from the main highway to be an accident. Daniel leaned closer as Evelyn enlarged the image. Why would they take him there? Because if he looked injured, a doctor could treat him without filing too many questions, Evelyn said, though the explanation tasted bitter. Or because someone there is being paid not to ask any. Daniel's hand closed slowly over his knee. She could see him fighting the old reflex, the old wound that whispered, "This is what people like her do. This is what empires buy." But he did not pull away from her. Instead, he asked, "What do you need me to do?" The question struck her more deeply than any declaration could have. Not "what have you done?" Not "can I trust you?" Not "how much of this belongs to your family?" What do you need me to do? Evelyn looked at him, and in the passing light his face seemed both familiar and newly precious. "If we find him, he may trust you before he trusts me." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Because of my father. Because you know what it means to be crushed by people who believe paperwork can bury a life." He absorbed that quietly. Then he nodded. The clinic sat at the edge of a farming town, behind a row of winter bare trees and a narrow road shining with rain. Its sign flickered weakly, blue letters humming above a single-story building with peeling white paint. Evelyn's security team arrived first, but stayed back, as instructed. 2 vehicles parked without blocking the exits. A legal observer remained on a recorded line. Everything was careful, measured, deliberate. Daniel watched Evelyn step out beneath the rain. There was no diamond necklace tonight, no boardroom armor beyond her tailored coat and the steady set of her shoulders. Yet she carried more authority than he had ever seen. Not the cold authority of a woman above others, but the grave authority of someone finally willing to stand between harm and the harmed. Inside, the clinic smelled of disinfectant, damp wool, and old fear. A young nurse at the reception desk looked up too quickly. Evelyn recognized that look. People in crisis all wore some version of it. The face of someone who had been told not to know what they knew. "We're looking for a patient brought in within the last hour," Evelyn said. The nurse's lips parted. "We can't disclose." Evelyn placed a card. On the counter, not her corporate card, but the contact of the attorney waiting outside. "You're not in trouble if you help us. You may be in danger if you don't." The nurse's eyes dropped to the card. Her hands shook. From somewhere deeper in the clinic came the muffled sound of a man coughing. Daniel moved first, not aggressively, not with force. He simply stepped past Evelyn, his voice low and human. "My name is Daniel Reyes. My father died because people were afraid to speak. If the man back there knows something, he doesn't need another powerful person threatening him. He needs someone to make sure he survives telling the truth." The nurse looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face gave way. "Exam room 3, she whispered. "They left him. Said someone else would come." Evelyn's blood turned cold. They walked down the short hallway together. Every step seemed too loud. At the 3rd door, Daniel paused, then pushed it open gently. The man inside was older than Evelyn had imagined, with grey hair flattened by rain, and a bruise blooming along his jaw. One wrist had been wrapped in gauze. He sat on the edge of an exam bed, still wearing a wrinkled shirt under a coat too thin for the weather. His eyes darted toward Evelyn and hardened immediately. "No," he said. His voice was hoarse. "No, Val, I told them already. I don't know anything." Evelyn stopped just inside the room. She did not approach. She did not use his name like ownership. "Mr. Holden, my mother trusted you." The effect was instant and painful. The old man flinched as if she had opened an old wound. "Your mother is dead," he said. "Yes," Evelyn answered, "and I have spent too much of my life obeying the people who used her death to hide what she tried to stop." Silence settled. Daniel remained beside her, not touching her, but close enough that Evelyn felt the warmth of him. She was grateful for that small turn. Mr. Holden's gaze shifted to Daniel. Recognition moved through his tired eyes. "Rise," he murmured. "Mateo's boy." Daniel's throat tightened. "You knew my father." The auditor closed his eyes briefly. "He came to me 3 weeks before the accident. Said the pressure valves were failing. Said the maintenance logs were being altered. He thought if he gave the evidence to compliance, someone would act." A bitter laugh broke in his chest. He still believed forms mattered. Daniel looked as if someone had struck him in a place no one else could see. Evelyn's hands curled at her sides. She wanted to apologize, but apology felt too small, too late, too clean for what had been allowed to rot. "Who ordered the cover-up?" she asked softly. Mr. Holden's eyes returned to her. "You know, I need to hear it." He swallowed. Rain tapped against the small window behind him. "Victor Vale. He said the subsidiary couldn't survive a shutdown. Said investors would panic, regulators would smell blood, competitors would attack. Your mother refused to sign the revised report, so he used an old signature page and attached it to a new clearance memo." Evelyn's breath left her. She had known, almost. She had suspected. She had carried the shape of the truth inside her since Nora found the recording. But hearing it aloud from the man who had seen the documents, from the man who had watched the lie become official, made something in her finally break cleanly. Not into weakness, into clarity. "And Adrian Blackwell?" she asked. Mr. Holden looked toward the door, fear returning. His father chaired the Regulatory Committee's Private Advisory Council at the time. Blackwell money helped bury the complaint. A call was made. The inspection was postponed. After the accident, the penalties were reduced. Everyone got something, except the dead. Daniel turned away for a moment, one hand braced against the wall. Evelyn saw him fighting grief, rage, and the terrible humiliation of having guessed the truth for years, and still being unprepared for its exact cruelty. She wanted to touch him. She did not know if she had the right. Then Daniel faced the auditor again. His voice was quiet, but it shook. "Will you testify?" Holden's expression collapsed into exhaustion. "You think I haven't wanted to? You think I sleep?" He lifted his bandaged wrist. "They found me tonight after 12 years. I have a daughter in Oregon. 2 grandchildren. Victor knows their names. Blackwell knows where they go to school. If I speak and they die, your truth won't comfort me." No one answered immediately. Outside the room, Evelyn could hear Nora's voice faintly through her phone, coordinating arrivals, legal lines, safe routes. This was the moment, Evelyn realized, when power usually revealed its true nature. The old Vale instinct would have pushed harder. Bought testimony. Cornered fear turned a frightened man into a useful instrument. She could almost hear Victor's voice. Secure the witness. Control the narrative. Protect the company. But Daniel was standing there with his father's grief in his eyes. Mr. Holden was trembling not from guilt alone, but from love for people who had done nothing wrong. And Evelyn suddenly understood that conscience did not mean demanding sacrifice from others while calling it justice. It meant being the one who paid first. "I will protect them," she said. Mr. Holden stared at her. "I can't promise safety exists, but I can promise resources, legal relocation, private protection, injunctions, press exposure for if anyone approaches them, and sworn affidavits placed beyond my control. I can promise that if Victor or the Blackwells move against your family, the entire country will know why before sunrise." His mouth trembled. Evelyn stepped closer, slowly this time. "And I can promise one more thing. I will not ask you to stand alone while I remain comfortable." Daniel looked at her. Then there were no grand words between them. No confession dramatic enough for the moment. But something passed across the small, fluorescent-lit room. Something steadier than passion, more costly than desire. Daniel saw her not as the heiress of the empire that had wounded him, and not as the lonely woman who had once eaten noodles with him under a false name. He saw her choosing what to do with the power she had inherited, and Evelyn saw him let himself believe her. Mr. Holden's shoulders lowered by an inch, as if he had been carrying the past so long that even doubt had become heavy. "If my daughter is moved first," he said. "If I speak to her and hear she's safe." Evelyn nodded. "Done." The word was simple. The consequences were not. Within an hour, the quiet clinic became the center of an invisible war. Calls moved across states. Protective details were dispatched. Legal declarations were drafted on encrypted channels. Nora worked with the precision of a woman who had spent years waiting for her employer to stop surviving and start fighting. A judge agreed to receive sealed testimony. A journalist known for corporate investigations was quietly alerted that documents might arrive if anything happened to the witness. Evelyn watched it all unfold and felt no triumph, only grief, and beneath grief, a strange steadiness. Daniel stood beside her under the clinic awning, while Mr. Holden spoke to his daughter on a secure line inside. The rain had thinned into mist, somewhere beyond the dark fields. Morning was still hours away. "I used to think your world only knew how to take," Daniel said. Evelyn looked down at her hands. "So did I sometimes." He was quiet for a long moment, not to comfort a fragile woman, not to forgive everything too soon, simply to stand with her. His palm was warm, calloused, real. Evelyn held on. "I don't know how to undo what happened to your father," she whispered. You can't. Daniel's voice was low. But tonight you stopped running from it. That almost undid her. She closed her eyes, feeling the rain touch her lashes. And for the first time since Margaret's recording had torn open the past, Evelyn did not feel trapped between love and power. The choice had changed shape. Perhaps power was not something she had to abandon to be worthy of love. Perhaps power had to be remade until it no longer resembled Victor at all inside her coat. Her phone began to vibrate once, twice, then again and again. Nora's name lit the screen. Evelyn answered, still holding Daniel's hand. For a second there was only the sound of Nora breathing too fast. Evelyn, Nora said, her voice tight with urgency. Victor knows Holden is alive. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the phone. Daniel turned toward her. Nora continued, each word landing like a door locking shut. He's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. The agenda is already circulating. Evelyn looked out at the wet road, at the security cars waiting in the dark, at the fragile beginning of truth they had just pulled back from the edge. What agenda? She asked. Though some part of her already knew, Nora's voice dropped. To remove you as chairwoman before any testimony can surface. By dawn, Vale Tower had become a different kind of battlefield. It did not roar. It did not shake. It waited. The building rose out of the grey morning like a blade of glass, every floor lit too early, every elevator already moving, every security guard standing with the stillness of people who had been warned not to ask questions. Rain had washed the city through the night, leaving the streets glossy and cold. Evelyn watched the reflection of her car slide along the tower's entrance and thought, strangely, of Daniel's pharmacy at opening time. The first turn of the key, the faint smell of paper bags and antiseptic, the bell above the door trembling in welcome. There was no welcome here. Nora met her inside the private lobby, her hair pinned neatly, her tablet pressed against her chest, her face pale beneath the professional calm she wore like armor. They moved the meeting up by 20 minutes, Nora said quietly. Victor arrived before 7. Adrian is already upstairs. Of course he was. Evelyn removed her gloves one finger at a time. She had slept less than an hour, not because of fear, but because the evidence they had gathered. The photograph, the old names, Holden's living testimony, had opened a wound so deep that rest felt almost disrespectful. Daniel stood beside her in a dark coat borrowed from one of Evelyn's security staff because his own had been soaked through last night. He looked out of place under the marble ceiling, but not diminished. Tired, yes. Angry, yes. But steady in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache. You don't have to go in, she said to him. Daniel looked at the elevators, then at her. If they're going to talk about me like I'm a weapon, I'd rather be in the room. Nora's expression flickered with concern. Victor wants that. I know, Daniel said. Evelyn knew it too. Victor had always understood the cruelty of a stage. If he could not break Evelyn in private, he would try to isolate her in public. If he could not erase the truth, he would stain the person standing closest to it. The elevator carried them upward in silence. Each number rising on the panel felt less like progress than a countdown. On the 58th floor, the boardroom doors stood open. Evelyn had presided over that room for 6 years. She knew the weight of the long black table, the view of the river beyond the windows, the disciplined arrangement of water glasses and leather folders, the hidden microphones beneath polished wood. She knew which board members avoided eye contact before betraying someone, and which ones smiled when they intended to wound. Today, almost all of them looked away. Victor Vale sat at the far end of the table, in the chair that was not his. He did not rise when she entered. His silver hair was immaculate, his tie dark blue, his hands folded with the solemn patience of a man attending a funeral he had personally arranged. Adrian Blackwell stood near the windows, elegant and still, his face composed into concern. He glanced once at Daniel, and the faint contempt in that glance was so swift, Most people would have missed it. Evelyn did not. Evelyn, Victor said, his voice heavy with practiced regret. Thank you for joining us under difficult circumstances. She walked to her chair, the one at the head of the table, the one Victor had not taken only because even now he wanted her to surrender it herself. Daniel remained behind her near the wall. Beside Nora, he had no seat. That small insult landed with more force than Evelyn expected. She sat down. Let's begin, she said. Victor opened a folder. It is with profound disappointment, he began, that I bring before this board a matter concerning the chairwoman's recent conduct, judgment, and potential exposure of Vale International to legal, reputational, and financial harm. The language was familiar enough to be almost boring. Evelyn had heard men hide ambition behind procedure all her life. What was different was the photograph Victor's assistant projected onto the wall. A moment later, Evelyn and Daniel outside the clinic. Daniel holding her wrist, her face turned toward him, unguarded, vulnerable, in a way she had never permitted near company cameras. Another image followed. Daniel entering the service elevator at one of Vale's archive facilities with Nora behind him. The timestamp had been altered. Evelyn saw it immediately. Nora inhaled sharply. Then another. Daniel outside Vale Tower after midnight, taken from an angle that made him look furtive rather than exhausted. These images, Victor said, were obtained from internal security reviews initiated after unusual access patterns were detected in restricted corporate systems. That's not true, Nora said before she could stop herself. Victor did not even look at her. Miss Lin, you will have an opportunity to speak when called upon. Evelyn kept her face still, though something hot and precise moved beneath her ribs. Victor continued, Mr. Daniel Reyes is not merely a private citizen involved romantically with our chairwoman. He is the son of Mateau Reyes, deceased former employee of the Halewick manufacturing site, whose family has long been associated with complaints against this company. In recent weeks, Mr. Reyes has gained proximity to Ms. Vale, to restricted archives, to confidential personnel records, and to witnesses connected with a matter that could expose Vale International to historic litigation. A murmur passed around the table. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Adrian stepped forward then. Not too much, only enough to remind everyone that he belonged to the same world as they did. No one here wishes to police Evelyn's personal life, he said, gentle as a knife wrapped in silk. But when personal attachment becomes a channel for corporate sabotage, the board has a duty to act. Evelyn turned her eyes to him. How generous of you to define duty. A few members shifted uneasily. Victor sighed. This is not an attack. It is a rescue before irreversible damage is done. The next slide appeared. It was a cropped image of Daniel's hand holding a flash drive. Evelyn remembered the moment. It had been Nora's backup copy of public compliance files, nothing more. Handed over in the parking garage after the archive door jammed and security had been rerouted. In the image, the background had been darkened. The file label had been blurred. The implication was obvious. Mr. Reyes was seen taking possession of confidential materials, Victor said. We have reason to believe he intends to use them to manufacture a claim against Vale International in relation to his father's death. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying. My father died because someone decided his life cost less than a delayed shipment. The room froze. Victor's eyes sharpened. He had wanted anger. He had wanted Daniel to sound like a threat. And there it is, Victor said softly, revenge. Daniel looked at him. Truth. You entered a world you do not understand, Adrian said, his tone still polite, still poisonously calm. You used Evelyn's loneliness, you gained her trust. You positioned yourself near evidence you had no right to touch. Evelyn stood. The movement was small, but the room changed around it. Enough, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice that had closed acquisitions, survived Senate hearings, and held collapsing markets steady. Yet beneath it now was something those men had never heard from her before. Not uncertainty, but feeling. Victor leaned back. Evelyn, I urge you to consider carefully. No one is asking you to humiliate yourself further. She looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she saw not her mother's brother, not the man who had taught her how to read hostile rooms, not the family elder whose approval she had chased in cold corridors. She saw a frightened man guarding a buried crime with the body of a company. You are asking me to lie, she said. A silence fell so clean it seemed to cut the air. Evelyn placed both hands on the table. Daniel Reyes did not exploit me. He did not steal from this company. He did not manufacture grief. His father, Mateo Reyes, died after raising safety concerns at Halewick, concerns this company had a duty to investigate. Instead, records were buried. Witnesses were paid off or threatened. Signatures were forged. And for years Vale International called silent stability. Victor's face hardened. You have no verified basis for those accusations. I have enough to open an independent investigation, Evelyn said. Effective immediately, I am authorizing external counsel, forensic auditors, and a special committee with no ties to the Vale family to review the Halewick accident, the handling of post-incident records, and any executive misconduct connected to it. The board erupted, not loudly, but in overlapping objections, half-spoken warnings, the rustle of panic dressed as governance, stock impact, legal exposure, fiduciary responsibility, timing, public risk, all those clean phrases for one dirty fear. Victor rose at last. You do not have unilateral authority to expose the company to catastrophic liability while compromised by an intimate relationship with a potential claimant. Evelyn looked around the table. If this company can only survive by hiding how a man died, then it is already bankrupt in every way that matters. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. She knew that sentence had reached him, not as a grand declaration, but as a hand placed gently on an old wound. Victor turned to the board. Now there was no warmth left in him. Motion to suspend Evelyn Vale's executive powers, pending full review of her conduct, judgment, and conflicts of interest. During suspension, interim authority to be vested in the Emergency Governance Committee. Nora's face drained of color. Evelyn did not sit. One by one, the votes came. Some were apologetic, some were eager, some hid behind screens, clearing their throats before saying yes. Evelyn listened to each of them with an almost serene attention. It hurt, but not in the way she had expected. She had feared losing control would feel like falling from a great height. Instead, it felt like taking off a necklace that had been tightened around her throat for years. When the final vote passed, Victor looked at her with solemn triumph. Evelyn Vale, pending review, you are suspended from executive command of Vale International. There it was, the sentence that should have destroyed her. For a moment she thought of her mother Margaret Vale, smiling tiredly in old photographs. Standing beside men who mistook grace for weakness. She thought of the recording, of that trembling voice telling her that legacy was not obedience. She thought of Daniel in the rain, choosing not to hate her when hate would have been easier. Then Evelyn reached for her access card, removed it from the slim leather holder, and placed it on the table. The sound was small. Everyone heard it. You can suspend my title, she said. You cannot suspend the truth. Victor's mouth tightened. She turned, and this time she did not walk out ahead of Daniel. She walked beside him. No one stopped them. In the hallway, the air seemed colder. Nora followed, fighting tears she would never allow the board to see. For several steps, no one spoke. The tower around them hummed with ordinary power. Phones ringing, assistants whispering, elevators chiming, as if nothing irreversible had happened. Daniel looked at Evelyn. You lost everything in there. Evelyn gave a small, tired smile. No, I think I finally stopped losing myself. His expression broke then, not fully, only enough for her to see the pain he had been holding back, while strangers reduced his father's death to liability and his love to strategy. He reached for her hand. This time, in the heart of Vale Tower, she did not hesitate. They rode the elevator down together. In the lobby, news had already begun to spread. Employees pretended not to stare. Security staff stood at new angles. Somewhere above them, Victor was probably calling lawyers, bankers, directors, anyone who could help him turn the morning's vote into a cage. But Evelyn felt clear. Stripped of command, yes, exposed, vulnerable, uncertain of what would come next. Yet beneath all of it was a strange, steady warmth, as if the life she had always postponed had finally caught up with her at the door. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city was wet and bright under a thin break in the clouds. Evelyn stepped through the revolving doors with Daniel beside her, Nora just behind them. For one breath, the world seemed almost gentle. Then 2 police cars pulled up to the curb. Daniel stopped. Evelyn felt his hand tighten around hers before he slowly let go. 4 officers approached with the careful urgency of men performing something already decided. Behind them, a corporate security director from Vale stood near the entrance, refusing to meet Evelyn's eyes. "Daniel Reyes?" one officer asked. Daniel's face went still. "Yes, you're under arrest on suspicion of theft and unlawful possession of confidential corporate documents belonging to Vale International." Evelyn stepped forward. "That's false." The officer did not look unkind, that somehow made it worse. "Ma'am, please step back." Nora was already reaching for her phone, her voice shaking as she called legal counsel. Evelyn could hear cameras beginning to click somewhere near the curb. Employees had gathered behind the glass. A black sedan idled across the street, and through its tinted window, Evelyn saw the faint outline of Adrian Blackwell's profile. Daniel looked at her as the cuffs closed around his wrists. There was no accusation in his eyes, only a quiet apology, as if he regretted that loving her had brought them both to this sidewalk. Evelyn's heart clenched so hard she could barely breathe. "Daniel," she said. He held her gaze. "Don't trade the truth for me." Then the officers guided him toward the waiting car, and Evelyn stood in front of the empire that no longer belonged to her, watching the man she loved be taken away for a crime Victor had invented. By the time Daniel disappeared behind the door of the police car, Evelyn had already understood one thing with a strange, merciless clarity. Victor had not meant merely to frighten her. He had meant to teach her that love was a liability, that every person she cared for could be turned into a chain. He had chosen Daniel, not because Daniel was powerful, but because he was not. A man with no political family, no private counsel waiting on retainer, no board seat, no famous name polished by generations of inherited respect. Just a pharmacist from a neighborhood where people measured trust in filled prescriptions, winter coats delivered quietly, and the remembered names of children. For years, Evelyn had believed power meant preventing others from touching what belonged to her. Now she stood on the sidewalk outside Vale International, with reporters beginning to swarm and her own security staff refusing to meet her eyes, and realized she no longer truly owned anything. Not the company, not the narrative, not even the right to walk into her office and demand the truth. But Daniel's last words stayed with her. "Don't trade the truth for me." They were not a plea, they were a boundary. Perhaps the only gift a good man could give a woman who had been raised to solve everything by sacrifice and control. Nora reached her side, pale but steady, phone pressed against her ear. "Legal is on the way, but they're saying the complaint was filed by Vale International's interim executive office. Victor signed it." "Of course he did," Evelyn said. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. It was the old habit, the one polished in boardrooms and funerals and shareholder crises. But beneath it, something in her had changed. The calm was no longer armor for pride. It was shelter for purpose. Across the street, Adrian's sedan pulled away slowly. as if he wanted her to see that he had stayed long enough to enjoy the beginning of her defeat. Evelyn turned from it. "Nora," she said, "I need everyone who was ever ignored because they were inconvenient." Nora's eyes sharpened. "That's a long list." Good within an hour, Evelyn was no longer in the tower that bore her family name. She was in the back room of Daniel's pharmacy, sitting at a scratched wooden table beneath fluorescent lights that hummed softly above shelves of cough syrup and vitamin bottles. Nora had brought her laptop. Mr. Hand from the print shop came with coffee and paper cups. Mrs. Alvarez arrived with a cloth bag full of folders tied in yarn. 2 former workers from the closed Westbridge factory came after sunset, one walking with a cane, the other carrying an envelope so old the corners had softened. Evelyn had expected suspicion. She deserved it. The first few minutes were filled with silence, so thick she could feel each person deciding whether to help the woman whose name had been stamped on the compensation letters, the denial forms, the press statements after the accident that took Mateo Reyes. Then Mrs. Alvarez placed her bag on the table. "Daniel helped my grandson when insurance refused his asthma medicine," she said. "He said people shouldn't have to beg to breathe." The man with the cane looked at Evelyn for a long time. "Your company called us liars." Evelyn did not flinch. "I know." "Do you?" His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with years of swallowed anger. "Do you know what it's like to watch them put a number on your pain and then tell the newspaper you were grateful?" "No," Evelyn said softly. "I don't, but I'm here to listen now, and if you still have anything, letters, dates, names, I will use it to expose what was done." He studied her face as though searching for the old chairwoman in it, the woman who had once sat at the head of polished tables where lives became line items. Maybe he still saw her. Maybe she would always be partly there. At last, he slid the envelope toward her. "Your mother didn't sign the final approval," he said. "We all knew it. The signature looked wrong." Evelyn's fingers stilled on the paper. Nora looked up. The room seemed to narrow around the envelope. Piece by piece, the night gave her what the tower had concealed. A retired secretary remembered being told to destroy fax confirmations. A former safety inspector had kept a copy of a warning report because he feared someone would need it when the dead stopped being useful. The independent auditor whom Evelyn had once dismissed as overly cautious arrived, close to midnight, rain on his shoulders and exhaustion in his eyes. "I should have pushed harder," he said. "We all should have," Evelyn replied. He opened his laptop and showed them a trail of internal payments routed through consulting firms tied to Adrian's family office. The charges against Daniel had not been a panicked improvisation. They had been built in advance, waiting for the moment Evelyn became vulnerable. Blackwell Security submitted the tip, the auditor said. They claimed Daniel accessed restricted files through Messline's credentials. Nora let out a short, humorless breath. "I was with Evelyn when those files were copied. Daniel never touched my system." "We'll need more than that," Evelyn said. "We have more," he answered, "but not enough to clear him before the arraignment unless someone in their camp admits coordination." Everyone understood what that meant. Adrian. The name moved through the room without being spoken, heavy and inevitable. Evelyn leaned back in Daniel's chair. It was simple. Padded with a tear, on the counter outside, a small bell chimed whenever the front door opened. Even now, in crisis, neighbors came and went quietly, leaving food, phone numbers, offers of testimony. Not one of them asked what Evelyn could give them in return. For the first time in her life, she sat inside a room full of people who were helping not because they feared her, not because they owed her, not because her signature could change their salary or ruin their future. They helped because Daniel had once helped them, and slowly, painfully, she understood that this was a kind of power Victor had never learned to measure. Near dawn, her phone lit up. Adrian Blackwell. Nora saw the name and went still. Evelyn answered without speaking. Adrian's voice was gentle in the way knives were gentle when wrapped in silk. You must be tired. What do you want? To give you an exit. Outside, rain slid down the pharmacy window, turning the streetlights into blurred gold. Evelyn watched her reflection in the glass, loose hair, sleepless eyes, the same face magazines had once called untouchable. Daniel's case can disappear, miscommunication, overzealous security, a regrettable misunderstanding. At what price? A pause. Then, almost kindly, you know the price. Announce our engagement at the charity summit tomorrow. Publicly. You'll step back into stability. Victor will stop digging trenches. My family will support your return in a ceremonial capacity. And this unpleasant investigation into the past will end. The past includes dead men. The past includes settlements, Adrian corrected, documents, insurance, corporate exposure. Don't romanticize it because your pharmacist has sad eyes. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the contempt he had always hidden beneath manners. Not just for Daniel, but for anyone whose grief lacked market value. He goes home, Adrian said. Bruised pride, perhaps, but free. Isn't that what love is? Choosing the person over the principle. Evelyn looked at Nora, then at the auditor, then at the weary faces around Daniel's table. She saw Mrs. Alvarez's fingers tightened around a paper cup. She saw the former factory worker lower his eyes, as if already expecting the rich to make the same bargain they always made. For a moment the temptation was not small. Daniel behind bars. Daniel sleeping under fluorescent lights, wearing someone else's suspicion. Daniel, who had asked her for truth and not rescue, yet surely needed rescue too. Evelyn's heart ached with the old instinct, to pay any price, sign any paper, kneel before any altar of compromise, if it would bring him back through that pharmacy door. But then she heard his voice again. Don't trade the truth for me. So she let her silence stretch until Adrian mistook it for surrender. I'll need assurance, she said quietly, his tone warmed. Of course in person, Evelyn. If I'm going to destroy what little is left of my conscience, Adrian, I'd prefer not to do it over the phone. He gave a soft laugh, pleased by what he believed was bitterness. Still dramatic, still practical, she replied. Meet me at noon. They met in a private dining room above a members-only club, the sort of place where waiters spoke in whispers, and even sunlight seemed filtered through wealth. Evelyn wore cream silk, her hair pulled back, her expression composed enough to satisfy any man who preferred women beautiful in defeat. Adrian stood when she entered. He looked perfect, he always had. Tailored suit, calm smile, hands clean because men like him rarely touched the machinery of their own cruelty. You came, he said. You made an effective offer. He pulled out a chair for her. I never wanted to be your enemy. No, said. You wanted to be my owner. A faint shadow crossed his face, then vanished. I wanted to protect you from emotional self-destruction. By framing Daniel, he smiled as if she had said something naive. By encouraging events toward a necessary conclusion. Her phone lay inside her handbag on the chair beside her, recording every word. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the untouched glass of water. Say it clearly, Adrian. If I announce the engagement, your family retracts the complaint. Vale retracts it, Victor's complaint. With support from our legal team, yes. And the fabricated evidence will become irrelevant. She looked up, fabricated. Adrian's patience thinned. Evelyn, don't force me to use ugly words. Your assistant mishandled data. Daniel was convenient. No one important wants him imprisoned. We only need you reasonable. There it was. No confession wrapped in guilt, no villain's thunder. Just the casual tone of a man discussing table placement at a gala. Daniel's freedom, Mateo's death, her mother's forged legacy, all reduced to inconvenience. Evelyn rose. Adrian caught her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, firmly remind her what he believed he could still claim. The summit, he said. Tomorrow night, you will smile. You will stand beside me. you will end this. She gently removed his hand. Tomorrow, she thought, would not end anything the way he imagined. That evening, Evelyn was allowed to see Daniel for 12 minutes. The detention room smelled of disinfectant and old metal. A scratched glass partition separated them. And when Daniel entered on the other side, her breath caught despite all her preparation. He looked tired, not broken. Daniel Reyes did not know how to look broken, but there was a shadow beneath his eyes, a stiffness in his shoulders, a quiet humiliation that made Evelyn want to tear the building apart with her. Hands he picked up the phone, she did the same. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel smiled faintly, because even here he was trying to comfort her. You look like you haven't slept. You look like you're criticizing my skincare routine from jail. His smile softened, and that almost undid her. I'm sorry, she whispered. His eyes changed. Evelyn, no, let me say it. I'm sorry that my world reached for you. I'm sorry I didn't see sooner how many people it had already crushed. I'm sorry I thought love could be kept separate from truth. Daniel pressed his palm against the glass. After a moment, she lifted hers to meet it from the other side. You didn't put me here, he said, but I loved you while still trying to protect the parts of my life that made this possible. His throat moved. And now I'm going to clear your name. His gaze searched hers, wary not of her love, but of the cost of it. Not by giving them what they want. No, she said. Not by marrying Adrian. Not by burying Matteo. Not by letting Victor turn my mother's name into a locked door. The guard announced 5 minutes. Evelyn leaned closer to the glass, her voice lowered, steadier than her pulse. I recorded Adrian, he admitted enough. Nora has copies. The auditor is preparing the chain of evidence. The former workers are ready to testify. Daniel stared at her, emotion slowly breaking through his restraint. All those people came. For you, she said. And maybe a little for the truth. His eyes glistened, but he did not look away. I used to think money was the only thing that could move quickly enough to save someone, Evelyn said. But today I watched a neighborhood become stronger than a boardroom. Daniel's hand remained against the glass. Be careful. I'm done being careful in the way cowards taught me, Evelyn. She smiled then, small and aching. I won't trade the truth for comfort again, not even for the comfort of having you beside me one day sooner. The words hurt them both. She saw it. Freedom was so close and still not cheap enough to buy with silence. When the visit ended, Daniel stood before the guard could tell him to. He kept his palm on the glass until the last possible second, and Evelyn kept hers there too, separated by law, accusation, and everything her family had built out of fear. But when she walked out, she was no longer alone. The next night, the city's annual charity summit glittered beneath chandeliers and camera flashes. It was Adrian's kind of battlefield, elegant, public, crowded with donors who loved compassion best when it came with engraved plaques. Victor stood near the front with a statesman's expression. Adrian waited beside the stage, immaculate and certain, ready for Evelyn to purchase Daniel's freedom with a smile and a ring. The host announced her name. A hush moved across the ballroom. Evelyn stepped into the light, not wearing Adrian's diamonds, not carrying a prepared engagement statement, but holding in her hand the recording that could shatter them all. The recording played first in the silence, and that silence was so complete Evelyn could hear the faint scratch of the device in her own hand. Her mother's voice filled the ballroom, not loud, not dramatic, just unmistakably hers. If you are hearing this, Margaret Vale said, then the people I trusted have failed to protect the truth. I built Vale International with my hands and my conscience. And if one is ever used to hide the other, then the company will have lost its soul. The room changed in an instant. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Cameras lifted higher. Several investors frowned as if the words themselves had offended them. Victor's expression did not move at first, but the color beneath his skin drained. So quickly Evelyn almost pitied him. Almost. She looked past the chandeliers, past the polished faces and ceremonial smiles, and found Daniel standing near the side aisle, having been brought here not as a guest but as a risk to be managed. His wrists were free now. His gaze was steady. He was watching her with the same quiet faith he had given her when he had no reason to. The recording continued. Margaret spoke of the factory accident, of safety reports buried, of names altered, of compensation delayed until grief became exhaustion, of a man named Daniel Reyes, whose complaints had been dismissed because admitting them would have cost too much money and too much pride. Evelyn felt the floor beneath her shift, as though her entire life had become something she could no longer trust to stand on. Then her mother's voice sharpened, as if she had known the listener would need courage more than comfort. If my brother Victor is using my signature, my silence, or my daughter's name to preserve corruption, then I ask whoever hears this to stop him. Let my daughter choose conscience over inheritance. Let her be freer than I was. A collective murmur moved through the hall. It rose and fell like wind through tall grass. One of the regulators at the front sat very still. A journalist lowered her phone, then raised it again with both hands, now understanding she was no longer covering an event but witnessing a collapse. Victor finally spoke, his voice smooth enough to sound offended instead of guilty. This is a manipulated artifact. My sister was ill. She was not of sound mind when she recorded. Don't. Evelyn's voice cut through him with a clarity she did not know she possessed. Every eye turned to her. The ballroom, the city, the empire her family had made out of silence all seemed to hold its breath. She had spent years learning how to survive in rooms like this, by becoming controlled, unreadable, impossible to shake. But tonight, standing beneath the lights in a simple dark dress, instead of the armor Adrian had chosen for her, she felt the old structure of herself break open. She looked at Victor. You used my mother's signature on the safety transfer. You altered the board minutes. You tried to bury the accident before it reached the press, before it reached the families, before it reached me. Victor's eyes narrowed. Evelyn, you are upset. This is not the place. It is exactly the place. She lifted the device in her hand. The archive copies are already with the regulator. Nora sent them an hour ago. At the mention of her name, Nora stepped from the back row. She was pale, but composed, clutching a folder to her chest, as if it were a shield. For the first time, Victor looked truly shaken, not because he had been caught, but because someone he had underestimated had finally become dangerous. Adrian took one step toward Evelyn. You don't understand what this will do. To the market, to the workers, to your family. We can contain this if you simply... If I simply what? Evelyn asked, and there was something almost gentle in her tone now, which made it more devastating. Marry you. Sign away the truth. Let Daniel take the blame because it is cleaner for the people you call respectable. Adrian's jaw tightened. His confidence, so polished and expensive a moment ago, began to crack around the edges. You would destroy everything. No, she said. You did that when you decided profit mattered more than lives. The regulators were already moving. Security came forward, not toward Evelyn, but toward Victor. He tried to speak over them, tried to command, tried to summon the authority that had carried him for years, but the evidence had already stripped the room bare. He was no longer a power. He was a man in a suit being escorted toward consequences. When the handcuffs clicked shut, the sound was small. That was what made it unbearable. Victor turned his head once, finding Evelyn with a look she had once mistaken for loyalty. You will regret this, he said. Evelyn did not answer. For the first time in her life, she did not feel afraid of what a Vale man might threaten. The media surged forward. Questions broke apart the air. Investors began speaking in urgent, furious tones. Someone from the workers' families started crying, not loudly, but in the way people do when grief finally has somewhere to go. Then one of the family representatives stepped forward. A woman with rough hands and tired eyes looked at Evelyn as if she were deciding whether to hate her or believe her. Her voice trembled. "Is it true? Was my husband denied treatment because of this?" Evelyn swallowed. "Yes," she said, "and I am sorry." The woman's face crumpled, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in the shock of spoken aloud after years of being denied it. Daniel moved then, not to the center, but to where Evelyn could see him clearly. He had not come to rescue her. He had come to witness her choosing the hard thing. That was the difference between being loved and being managed. And Evelyn felt it in her bones. When the hall finally began to empty, when officials were taking statements and journalists were chasing the next angle of the story, she and Daniel found each other near a side corridor, washed in dim light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the ballroom receded behind them like a storm passing over water. Daniel looked at her first. "You did it." Evelyn laughed once, softly, with disbelief and grief tangled together. "It feels less like doing and more like losing everything at once." "You didn't lose everything." She searched his face, the one honest place left in a room built on masks. "No," he shook his head. "You lost the lie." That struck deeper than any declaration could have. Her throat tightened, and for a moment the composure she had worn so carefully all night slipped away. "I was so afraid that if I let go of power I would become nothing." Daniel's voice lowered. "You were never nothing. You just kept living, like you had to earn the right to be a person." She closed her eyes. There were so many things she might say. So many apologies for the pain, for the distance, for the nights he had spent carrying the weight of her world without asking to. But words felt too small for what had happened between them, so she reached for his hand instead. He took it immediately. By morning the city knew. By noon, the story was on every screen. Victor's arrest, the forged reports, the deaths and delays, Adrian's collapse as a political and business ally, the sudden, public unraveling of an empire that had seemed untouchable only days before. And in the middle of it, Evelyn stood before her board with no script. They waited for her to defend herself, to promise stability, to perform the old version of leadership. Instead, she placed a signed resignation on the table. The room erupted at once. "Evelyn," one director said sharply, "this is reckless." "This is madness," said another. "Without the controlling share, the company will fracture." Evelyn listened to all of it with an exhaustion so deep it felt almost peaceful. "Then let it fracture in a way that tells the truth," she said. "Vale International will not continue as a private inheritance machine built on secrecy and fear. It will be restructured into a foundation-led enterprise. Worker protections will be written into governance. A public compensation fund will be established for every affected family. Audits will be independent. No more hidden votes. No more impossible loyalty tests. No more lives balanced against quarterly profit." They stared at her as if she had spoken another language. One director said coldly, "You are giving away control." Evelyn met his gaze. "No, I am ending the illusion that control is the same thing as responsibility." After that, there was nothing left for them to say to her that mattered. The restructuring did not happen cleanly. Nothing meaningful ever did. There were lawyers, hearings, protests, days of ugly headlines, and nights when Evelyn woke from dreams of locked doors and glass walls. Yet slowly, something real began to replace the old machine. Families were compensated. Safety systems were rebuilt. The archives were opened. Some people resigned in disgust. Some stayed because they finally understood what leadership could be when stripped of vanity. Months passed. Evelyn was no longer the woman the city had once watched from behind auction tables and boardroom glass. She had become harder in some ways, softer in others. More honest, less protected. She lived in a smaller apartment near the district where Daniel worked. And though the walls were quieter, she had never felt so close to herself. Daniel saw it before she did. He always had. One afternoon, sunlight pooled across the sidewalk outside the pharmacy and the new community health center beside it. The center had taken longer to open than anyone expected, but Evelyn had refused to let it be symbolic only. It had to function. It had to serve. It had to be real. Inside, children laughed while parents filled out forms without fear of being ignored. A nurse called for someone's name. The scent of paper, antiseptic, and fresh paint mingled with the summer air. Evelyn stood near the entrance in a simple blouse, hair loosely pinned back. No title on her shoulders except her own name. A little boy with a scraped knee looked up at her curiously. "Are you famous?" he asked. She blinked, then before she could stop herself. "I used to be, I think." The boy considered this with grave seriousness, then wandered back to his mother. Daniel had been watching from the counter. Now he came to stand beside her, his hand brushing hers in the easy way of people who had already survived the hardest part. The boy's mother thanked them both for the clinic. Another family stepped in. Life kept arriving, as it always does, asking only whether someone will answer. The child turned back once more and pointed at Evelyn with the same open honesty that had undone so many of her old defenses. Daniel looked at Evelyn, and in that glance there was no awe, no fear, no calculation. Only recognition. He smiled. "She is someone who chose well, friend." The heiress who traded her empire for a quiet life. Isabella Cross had never once in 29 years been asked what she actually wanted. She was the sole heir to Cross Maritime, a shipping empire that stretched across 4 continents and answered to no government, no union, and certainly no woman's private wishes. Her father had built it from a single rusted freighter into a fleet of 600 vessels, and he had raised his daughter the same way he built ships, riveted plate by riveted plate, until nothing soft remained on the surface. On the morning her father's lawyers read the will, Isabella learned 2 things at once. The first was that she now controlled 90% of the company. The second was that the board had already signed a preliminary agreement to merge her freedom away, a marriage clause tucked into a shareholder pact that made her engagement to a rival shipping heir a condition of the inheritance itself. She left the reading of the will still wearing black, and she did not go home. Instead, she drove to the old harbour district, the part of the city the company no longer touched, where fishing boats still came in at dawn, smelling of salt and diesel, and where nobody in a suit had bothered to build a glass tower. She parked badly. She walked without a destination. And when the rain came sideways off the water, she ducked into the nearest open door, which happened to belong to a small boatyard repair shop run by a man named Matteo. He did not recognize her. He handed her a rag for her, wet hair, and a mug of something bitter and hot, and he went back to sanding the hull of an old sailboat, as though a stranger dripping on his floor were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You're not from the harbour," he said, not looking up, no. "Running from something?" "Running toward nothing in particular. Is that different?" He considered this with the same care he gave the wood beneath his hands. "Sometimes it's the same thing, wearing a better coat." Isabella laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound surprised her more than it surprised him. She came back the next day, and the day after that, always in plain clothes, always introducing herself only as Bella. She learned to sand a hull without splintering it. She learned that Matteo had inherited the boatyard from an uncle who drank too much and loved too easily, and that he kept it open more out of stubbornness than profit. She learned that he asked nothing of her except that she show up on time and not lie about being tired. It took 3 weeks for the board to find her. They arrived at the boatyard in 2 black cars, suits pressed, faces arranged into the particular blend of concern and threat that powerful men used when a woman had wandered outside the boundaries they had drawn for her. Her fiancé by paperwork, a cold and handsome man named Julian Ferro, stepped out first. "Isabella, this is beneath you." "Funny," she said, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that was not clean. "I've never felt more myself." Julian's eyes moved to Matteo, sizing him up and dismissing him in the same glance. "You cannot marry a mechanic and keep a company that sighs afloat." "I'm not marrying anyone the board picked for me," Isabella said. "And Matteo has kept more boats afloat than your entire fleet has kept promises." The board threatened to freeze her shares. They threatened litigation, scandal, the slow public unmaking of her father's legacy. Isabella listened to all of it, with the calm of someone who had already decided the ending. She restructured the company from a folding chair in the boatyard office, using a borrowed laptop and a phone that kept losing signal near the water. She converted Cross Maritime into an employee trust structure, sold the marriage clause back to the board as the illegal instrument it always had been, and funneled a portion of the company's profits into harbor restoration projects that kept small yards like Matteo's alive, instead of buried under corporate contracts. It was not clean. It was not fast. There were furious shareholder meetings and a lawsuit that dragged for months. But when it was finished, Isabella Cross no longer owned an empire. She owned a smaller, stranger, more honest life, and a boatyard where a man who had never once asked what her shares were worth waited for her every evening with sawdust in his hair and nothing to sell her. "Do you regret it?" Matteo asked her once, years later, as they watched the sun go down over water that finally felt like it belonged to no one and everyone. Isabella shook her head. "I spent 29 years being an heiress. I only started being a person the day I stopped being useful to people who called that love." He took her hand, rough with work, and said nothing else because nothing else needed saying. The tycoon who gave up his name, Marcus Cade, had a name that opened doors before he ever knocked on them. Cade Holdings owned half the skyline of a city that had once been a fishing town, and by the time Marcus turned 35, people had stopped calling him by his first name entirely. He was simply Cade, the way a storm is simply weather, something to be prepared for rather than known. He met Prior Anand on the worst night of his professional life. The night a hostile takeover he had spent 2 years. Engineering finally succeeded and left him feeling, for the first time, like a man who had won a war and lost the reason he started it. She was a school teacher grading papers alone in an all-night diner because her apartment's heating had failed again, and the landlord would not answer his phone. Marcus sat 2 booths away, still in his suit, staring at a congratulatory bottle of champagne he had not opened. And when the diner's ancient jukebox skipped the same 3 seconds of a song for the 5th time, Priya laughed quietly at the absurdity of it, and Marcus found himself laughing too. For the first time that year. "Rue night?" she asked. "I won something," he said. "I'm told that's supposed to feel better than this. What did you win?" He opened his mouth to say a company, 40,000 jobs, a board seat, a legacy, and instead he said, "I honestly don't know anymore." Priya did not ask his name that night, and he did not offer it. He learned instead that she taught 9-year-olds, that she had been grading essays about what her students wanted to be when they grew up, and that not one of the 42 essays mentioned money. They want to be astronauts and veterinarians, and one very insistent child wants to be a bridge, she said, sliding the essay across the table. Not a bridge builder, a bridge. Marcus read it twice, and something in his chest, calcified over a decade of boardrooms, cracked slightly open. He came back to that diner for 11 nights before he told her who he was, and when he did, Priya set down her coffee and studied him with an expression that held no awe at all. "That explains the suit," she said. "It doesn't explain why you keep coming here instead of wherever people like you are supposed to go, because nobody there asks what I've lost, only what I've gained." Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded far from cameras. grading papers at diner booths, walking children home from the after-school program where Priya volunteered, standing in the back of a school assembly, while a boy who wanted to be a bridge received a certificate for perfect attendance. Marcus discovered that the empire he had spent his life defending had never once made him feel as certain of his own worth as that boy's small, solemn handshake. The trouble came, as it always did, from the boardroom. Cade Holdings' senior partners had spent years quietly steering Marcus toward a merger with a rival dynasty, sealed by his engagement to a senator's daughter he had met exactly twice. When they discovered Priya, they treated her the way empires treat inconvenient truths. They tried to make her disappear from the narrative. A dossier appeared, fabricated and cruel, suggesting Priya had approached Marcus for money. Journalists were fed the story before Marcus even heard the accusation. He watched in real time as the machine he had built began grinding up the one person who had never asked it for anything. He did not defend himself in a press conference. He walked into the boardroom where his own father's portrait still hung, and, in front of the partners who had orchestrated it, resigned as chief executive, released every internal document proving Priya's dossier had been manufactured, and transferred controlling authority to an independent trust run by employees rather than family. "You're destroying 20 years of work," one partner said. "No," Marcus said. "I'm finally admitting whose work it actually was. It was never mine alone, and it should never have been used as a weapon against someone who wanted nothing from it." He kept his surname, because a name is not the same thing as an empire, but he stopped answering to Cade, the storm, and started answering again, simply to Marcus. The following spring, at the same diner with the same broken jukebox, Priya found a small velvet box waiting under her coffee cup instead of a receipt. Marcus had not planned a speech. He only said, "I don't have a company to offer you anymore. I have a name nobody's afraid of, and a Tuesday night booth. I'd like it to be yours too." She said yes before he finished the sentence, and somewhere in the back of the diner, the jukebox, for once, played the whole song through.